The vibrating clangor from the four great piston engines of their Lancaster bomber set teeth on edge. Smith looked away from the darkly opaque world beyond the windscreens and looked at the man in the left-hand captain's seat. Wing Commander Cecil Carpenter was as completely at home in his environment as the most contented oyster in his shell in Whitstable Bay. He slid open his side screen. An icy gust of snow-laden wind blew into the flight deck, carrying with it the suddenly deepened roar from the engines. Carpenter grimaced and twisted round to look at Smith. "It's no small thing, Major, to be lost in a blizzard in the night skies over war-torn Europe." Smith smiled politely. "You mean you don't know where we are, sir?" "How should I?" Carpenter slid down in his seat, half-closed his eyes, and yawned vastly. "I'm only the driver. We have a navigator, and the navigator has a radar set, and I've no faith in either of them." "Well, well," Smith shook his head. "To think that they lied to me at the Air Ministry. They told me you'd flown some 300 missions and knew the continent better than any taxi driver knows his London." Smith smiled, straightened from his cramped position behind the pilot's seats, left the flight deck, and moved aft into the Lancaster's fuselage. Huddled in those 6 chairs sat 6 men, probably, Smith reflected, the 6 most miserable men he'd ever seen. Like himself, each of the 6 was dressed in the uniform of the German Alpine Corps. The nearest parachutist, a dark, intense man with Latin features, looked up at Smith's arrival. He had never, Smith thought, seen Edward Caracciola look so unhappy. "Well," Caracciola's voice was as unhappy as his face, "I bet he's no more bloody idea where we are than I have. He does seem to navigate his way across Europe by opening his window and sniffing the air from time to time," Smith admitted. He broke off as a sergeant air gunner entered from the rear, carrying a can of steaming coffee and enamel mugs. "Yes, sir," the sergeant air gunner was unabashed. "To tell the truth, we fly east along the Swiss frontier. He says if it's a choice between a prisoner-of-war camp in Germany and internment in Switzerland, he knows which side of the frontier he's coming down on, and it's only a hop, skip and a jump to the Weisspitze." "I see," Smith said weakly. But don't the Swiss object?" "Frequently, sir." The Lancaster lurched as it hit an air pocket. Smith grabbed a rail to steady himself, and Lieutenant Morris Schaffer, of the American Office of Strategic Services, and Smith's second-in-command, cursed fluently as the better part of a cup of scalding coffee emptied itself over his thigh. "That's all I need," he said bitterly. "I've no morale left. I wish to God we would crash land in Switzerland." "You'd live a damn sight longer, friend," Caracciola observed morosely. He transferred his gaze to Smith. "The whole set-up stinks, Major." "I don't think I understand," Smith said quietly. "Suicidal is what I mean. What a bunch. Just look at us." He gestured to the 3 men sitting nearest to him on his left. Olaf Christiansen, a flaxen-haired first cousin of Leif Erikson, Lee Thomas, a short, dark Welshman, and Torrance Smythe, languidly aristocratic-looking. Christiansen, Thomas, old Smithy, and myself were just a bunch of civil servants, filing clerks. "I know what you are," Smith said quietly. "Or yourself, a major in the Black Watch. This is no more in your line than it is ours. Or Lieutenant Schaffer here, an airborne cowboy." "I hate horses," Schaffer said loudly. "That's why I had to leave Montana." "Or take George here." Caracciola jerked a thumb in the direction of the last member of the party, George Harrod, a stocky army sergeant radio operator, with an expression of profound resignation on his face. "I bet he's never as much as made a parachute jump in his life before." "I have news for you," Harrod said stoically. "I've never even been in a plane before." Smith said gently, "We were all the Colonel could get. He told us yesterday that the one thing he didn't have was time." "Deucely sorry and all that, chaps, but time is of the essence." Wyatt Turner, a big red-faced, heavily moustached colonel, tapped his cane against a wall map of Germany, pointing to a spot just north of the Austrian border and a little west of Garmisch-Partenkirchen. "Our man was brought down here at 2 a.m. this morning, but Schaeff, in their all-knowing wisdom, didn't let us know until 10 a.m. Damned idiots. Anyway, he's here. Schloss Adler, the Castle of the Eagle. Believe me, it's well named. Only an eagle could get there. Our job." Smith said, "How are you so sure he's there, sir?" "We're sure. Mosquito is in, crash-landed only 10 miles away. The pilot got off a radio message just before a German patrol closed in." He paused. "Schloss Adler, Major Smith, is the combined HQ of the German Secret Service and the Gestapo in South Germany. Where else would they take him? What's important is getting him out before he talks. Secrecy and stealth are the only hope," he went on. "And you gentlemen are, I trust, secretive and stealthy. You all speak fluent German. You are men with exceptional records of resourcefulness, ability, and ingenuity. If anyone has a chance, you have." "Of course," Caracciolo echoed, his face carefully deadpan. Then he looked speculatively at Wyatt Turner. "There is, of course, another way, sir." He paused, then went on very quietly indeed. "A way with 100% guarantee of success." "Neither Admiral Roland nor I claim to be infallible," Wyatt Turner said. "You have the answer to our problems?" "Yes. Whistle up a Pathfinder squadron of Lancasters with 10-ton blockbuster bombs. Do you think that anyone in the Schloss Adler would ever talk again?" "I don't think so." Admiral Roland spoke gently and for the first time. "The captured man, Lieutenant General Carnaby, is an American. If we were to destroy him, General Eisenhower would probably launch his second front against us instead of against the Germans." Caracciolo had apparently nothing to say. Colonel Wyatt Turner cleared his throat. "That's it then, gentlemen. 10 o'clock tonight at the airfield. No more questions, I take it?" Sergeant George Harrod sounded heated. "What's this all about? Why is this geezer so bloody important?" "That'll do, Sergeant." Wyatt Turner's voice was sharp. Admiral Roland interrupted gently. "General Carnaby is the overall coordinator of Operation Overlord, the Second Front. It would be true to say that he knows more about the Allied preparations for the Second Front than any man alive. He set off last night to meet his opposite numbers. The rendezvous was in Crete, the only meeting point the Russians would accept. They haven't a plane fast enough to outrun the German fighters. The British Mosquito can, but it didn't last night." His words came very slowly. "And if the General talks—" "He'll talk," Roland said. "He won't be able to stop himself. A mixture of mescaline and scopolamine. And he'll tell them all the plans for the Second Front." The words came as from a man in a dream. "I understand, sir. Now I understand." Harrod turned to Wyatt Turner. "Sorry I spoke like that, sir. I'm afraid. Well, I'm a bit edgy, sir." Sergeant Harrod huddled more closely into his bucket seat, beat freezing hands against freezing shoulders, morosely surveyed his uniform, wrinkled like an elephant's legs and about 3 sizes too big for him. Caracciolo said heavily, "I still say we should have sent in the Lancasters." Smith looked away without saying anything. Wing Commander Carpenter switched on the intercom. "Major Smith?" "Yes." 30 minutes to go." Smith hung up the headphones and looked at the 6 seated men. "That's it, then. Half an hour. Let's hope it's warmer down there than it is up here." They helped each other strap loads on their backs beneath the high-mounted parachutes, then struggled into their white waterproof snow trousers. Silently they clipped their parachute snap catchers onto the overhead wire, the sergeant air gunner carefully checking each catch. Nearest the door and first man to jump was Sergeant Harrod. Behind him stood Lieutenant Schaffer, whose experiences with the OSS had made him by far the most experienced parachutist of the group, and whose unenviable task it was to keep an eye on Harrod. He was followed by Caracciolo, then Smith. As leader, he preferred to be in the middle of the group, then Christiansen, Thomas, and Torrance Smythe. The tension was back in the air again. The bell rang above the head of the sergeant air gunner standing by the fuselage door. He looked at the tense, expectant faces before him and nodded. 2 minutes, gentlemen." Above the starboard door in the fuselage, a red light came on. The sergeant air gunner laid his hand on the door. 1 minute, gentlemen." He jerked the door wide open, securing it on its standing latch, and a miniature blizzard howled into the belly of the Lancaster. "When the red light turns green—" He left the sentence unfinished. The Lancaster, like some great black pterodactyl from out of the primeval past, roared on through the driving snow alongside the smoothly precipitous side of the Weisspitze. That sheer wall of ice-encrusted rock seemed very close indeed. Sergeant Harrod's lips weren't dry. but that was only because his face was taking the full brunt of the horizontally driving snowstorm that lashed along the bomber's fuselage. Slowly, the mountainside fell away. Sergeant Harrod, head craned back at a neck-straining angle, saw the red light turn to green, brought his head down, screwed his eyes shut, and with a convulsive jerk of his arms, launched himself out into the snow and the darkness. Schaffer was the next to go, smoothly, cleanly, feet and knees together, then Carracciola, followed by Smith. Smith glanced down below him, and his lips tightened. Just dimly visible in the greyness beneath, Harrod, a very erratic human pendulum, was swinging wildly across the sky. The parachute cords were already badly twisted, and his clumsily desperate attempts to untwist them resulted only in their becoming more entangled than ever. Smith stared after the rapidly disappearing figure, and hoped to God that he didn't side-slip his way right over the edge of the precipice. Even before the last of the parachutists, Torrance Smythe, had cleared the doorway, the sergeant air gunner was running towards the after end of the fuselage. Swiftly he flung aside a packing case, dragging a tarpaulin away, reached down and pulled a huddled figure upright. A girl, quite small, with wide dark eyes and delicate features. Over her snowsuit she wore a parachute. "Come on, Miss Ellison!" His arm round her waist, he moved quickly towards the doorway. "Not a second to lose." The sergeant snapped the parachute catch onto the wire. Mary Ellison turned away abruptly and dropped out into the darkness. The last parachute and the container followed at once. For a long moment the sergeant stared down into the darkness. Smith reached his hands far up into the parachute shrouds, hauled himself sharply upwards, and made a perfect knees-bent, feet-together landing in about 2 feet of snow. Down there at ground level, if 7,000 feet up on the Weisspitze could be called ground level, the snowfall was comparatively slight compared to that blizzard they'd experienced jumping from the Lancaster. With fumbling, frozen hands he clumsily extracted a torch and whistle from his tunic. The first to appear was Thomas, then Schaffer, then, within 2 minutes altogether, all of the others with the exception of Sergeant Harrod. "Pile your chutes there and wait them," Smith ordered. "Yes, bed them deep. Anyone seen Sergeant Harrod?" A shaking of heads. "Nobody? No sight of him at all?" "Use your torches," Smith said abruptly. "Spread out. Find him." 3 minutes passed, and then came a shout from the right. Smith broke into a run. Carracciola it was who had called, and was now standing at the farther edge of a wind-swept outcrop of bare rock. Half buried in its white depths, Sergeant Harrod lay spread-eagled on his back. He did not seem to notice the snow falling on his eyes. They were all there now, staring down at the motionless man. Smith jumped down into the drift, dropped to his knees, slid an arm under Harrod's shoulders. "Dead?" Carracciola asked. "He's dead. His neck is broken." Smith's face was without expression. "He must have got caught up in the shrouds and made a bad landing." Schaffer dropped to his knees and began to fumble for the buckle of the strap securing the radio to Harrod's back. He rose to his feet, the radio dangling from his hand, and looked at Smith. Smith took the radio. "It made a better landing than Sergeant Harrod," Smith said briefly. "Come on." "No, for God's sake, don't lose your grip," Thomas said urgently. "That's the trouble with you Celts," Schaffer said. "No faithing anyone. There's no cause for alarm. Your life is in the safe hands of Schaffer and Christensen. Not to worry." "I've seen all I want to," he said over his shoulder. They pulled him back. "Vertical, smooth as glass, and you can't see the bottom. How deep you reckon it is, Major?" "Who knows?" Smith shrugged. "We're 7,000 feet up. Break out that nylon." The proper supply pack was located, and the nylon produced. 1,000 feet of it coiled inside a canvas bag, as it had come from the makers. Smith tied a hammer to one end, and with 2 of the men holding him securely, paid it out over the edge, counting his arm spans as he let it go. Finally the rope went completely slack, and it remained that way. "Well," Smith moved back from the edge, "that seems to be about it." "And if it isn't, eh?" Christensen asked. "If it's caught on a teensy-weensy ledge 1,000 feet above, damn all?" "I'll let you know," Smith said shortly. "You measured it off," Carracciola said. "How deep?" 200 feet. 800 feet left, eh? Thomas grinned. "We'll need it all to tie up the garrison of the Schloss Adler." No one was amused. Smith said, "I'll need a piton and 2 walkie-talkies." Smith checked that there were no sharp or abrasive edges on the cliff top, wriggled cautiously over, and gave the signal to be lowered. The descent itself was simple. His feet passed through 18 inches of snow and rested on solid ground. It appeared to be a smooth plateau sloping gently outwards from the cliff. He climbed out of the double bowline and made the switch on the walkie-talkie. "Okay, so far. Haul up the rope. Supplies first, then yourselves." The rope snaked upwards into the darkness. Within 5 minutes all the equipment had been lowered in 2 separate loads. Christiansen appeared soon afterwards. While he was away reconnoitring, all the others came down. Christiansen returned. "It's not so bad," he reported. "There's another cliff ahead of us, maybe 50 yards away, curving around to the east. At least I think it's a cliff. But the plateau falls away gently to the west there. Trees, too. I followed the line of them for 200 yards. "Trees? At this altitude?" "Well, no masts for a tall ship. Scrub pine. They'll give shelter, hiding." "Fair enough," Smith nodded. "We'll bivouac there." "We pitched the tents right away, boss?" Schaffer asked. "Yes." In Schaffer's book, Smith reflected, boss was probably a higher mark of respect than either major or sir. "Then hot food, hot coffee, and a try for London on the radio. Haul that rope down, Christiansen. Come the dawn, we don't want to start giving heart attacks to any binocular-toting characters in the Schloss Adler." Christiansen nodded, began to haul on the rope. "Jesus," Smith drew the back of his hand across his forehead. "That was a close one." "What's up?" Schaffer asked quickly. "2 of you. Hoist me up, quickly, before the damn rope disappears." "The radio." Smith let out a long sigh of relief. "There's only one list of frequencies, call signs and code. Security. And that one list is inside Sergeant Harrod's tunic." "I'll go get it for you if you like," Christiansen volunteered. "Thanks, but it's my fault and I'll get it." "It's a bad night," Schaffer said. "I'll come give you a hand." "Thanks, no need. I'll haul myself up and lower myself down." He moved out and reappeared shortly afterwards carrying the radio, which he placed in front of Schaffer. "I don't want to go all the way up there to get the code book just to find that some hobnailed idiot has fallen over this and given it a heart attack. Guard it with your life, Lieutenant Schaffer." "Aye, aye, sir," Schaffer said solemnly. With a hammer and a couple of spare pitons hanging from his waist, Smith secured himself to the rope, with double bowline and belt as before, grabbed the free end of the rope and began to haul himself up. He had overlooked the crippling effect of altitude to a man unaccustomed to it. At last he reached the top. He moved a few feet farther away from the cliff edge, cleared away the snow, and lightly hammered in one of the spare pitons he had brought with him. Then he walked up the gently sloping plateau, whistling Lorelei. A figure appeared out of the night, and came stumbling and slipping in the deep snow. It was Mary Ellison.
"Well," he could hear her teeth chattering, "you took your time about it, didn't you?"
"Never wasted a minute," Smith said. "I had to have a hot meal and coffee first."
"You had to have... You beast, you selfish beast!"
She took a quick step forward and flung her arms around his neck.
"I hate you."
"I can't help what you think," Smith said kindly, patting her on the back. "Where's your gear?"
50 yards, and stop patting me in that avuncular fashion."
They trudged upwards through the deep snow, Mary holding his arm tightly. She said curiously,
"What on earth excuse did you give for coming back up here?"
"There was something I had to come for, something apart from you. The radio code book inside Sergeant Harrod's tunic." She stopped, puzzled.
"It's chained."
"It's still inside Sergeant Harrod's tunic," Smith said somberly. "He's up here, dead."
"Dead?"
She clutched him by the arms.
That nice man. I heard him saying he'd never jumped before. A bad landing?"
"So it seems." He took her arm and they moved off. It took Smith no more than 2 minutes to locate Sergeant Harrod, now no more than a featureless mound buried in the depths of the snowdrift. Smith undid the dead man's tunic, recovered the code book, hung the chain round his neck, and buttoned the book securely inside his own Alpencorps uniform. Then came the task of turning Sergeant Harrod over on his side. Unpleasant Smith had expected it to be, and it was. Smith knelt, brought his torch close, and carefully examined the back of the dead man's head. "What are you trying to do?" Mary asked. "What are you looking for?" His neck is broken. I want to find out just how it was broken." He glanced up at the girl. "You don't have to look." Smith cleared the snow for 2 feet around where Harrod's head had lain. With hand and eyes, he examined the ground with meticulous care, rose slowly to his feet, took Mary's arm, and began to walk away. Halfway back to the cliff edge, Smith said abruptly, "Something struck Harrod on the back of the neck. I thought it might have been a rock, but there was no rock where he lay, only turf. He was struck by some hard metallic object, either the butt of a gun or the haft of a knife. The skin is broken, but there's no bruising, for the neck was broken immediately afterwards, when he was unconscious, to make us think it was an accident." Mary stopped and stared at him. "Do you realize what you're saying?" She caught his speculative and very old-fashioned look, took his arm and went on quickly. "No, I mean the implications. I'm sorry, of course you do, John. I'm scared." "Me too." "I don't believe you." "Well, if I'm not, it's damn well time I started to be." They were back at the edge of the cliff. "Let's wait a minute. I want to watch this rope." "Why the rope?" "Why not?" "Don't tell me," Mary said resignedly. "I'm only a little girl. I suppose you know what you're doing." "I wish to God I did," Smith said feelingly. The minutes passed, 3, maybe 4. They felt more like 30 or 40. He rose to leave when suddenly the rope gave a violent jerk, and the piton farther from the cliff edge was torn free. The loop of the rope slid quickly down past the piton to which it was anchored, and kept on going till it was brought up short by its anchor. The rope was bar-taut, and remained bar-taut, but the piton held. What on earth?" Mary began, then broke off. Smith murmured, "Someone down there doesn't like me." Surprised? If that spike hadn't held, we'd never have got down again." The tremor in her voice wasn't all due to the cold. Smith checked his descent when he estimated he was about 40 feet from the base of the cliff. He took 2 turns of the nylon round his left leg, clamped it with his right, took a turn round his left arm, pulled off his right gauntlet with his teeth, stuffed it inside his tunic, eased out his Luger, slid the safety catch, and went on his way again. But there was no reception committee waiting. The rope puller had evidently opted for discretion. In 2 minutes he had Mary's kit bag down, and a few minutes later Mary herself. Rope over one shoulder, her kit bag on the other, Smith led Mary to the fissure in the cliffside. "I'll be along in the morning before we leave." He walked away, stopped, looked back. Mary was still standing where he had left her, looking after him. Locating his own tent was simple enough. A steady light burned inside it. Smith beat the snow from his clothes, stooped, and entered. Christiansen, Thomas, and Caracciolo were in their sleeping bags, and were asleep, or appeared to be. Torrance Smythe was checking over their store of plastic explosives, fuses, detonators, and grenades, while Schaffer was reading a paperback and faithfully guarding the radio. He looked at Smith. "Okay?" "Okay." Smith produced the code book from his tunic. "Sorry I was so long, but I thought I'd never find him. Drifting pretty badly up there." "We've arranged to take turns on watch," Schaffer said. "Half an hour each. It'll be dawn in 3 hours. Smith turned his attention to Harrod's code book, and spent about 10 minutes in memorizing call-up signals and wave frequencies, and writing a message out in code. Before he had finished, Schaffer had turned into his sleeping bag, leaving Torrance Smythe on watch. Smith folded the message, tucked it in a pocket, rose, took the radio and a rubber ground sheet to protect it from the snow. "I'm going to move out a bit," he said to Torrance Smythe. "Reception is lousy among trees. Besides, I don't want to wake everyone up. Won't be long." 200 yards from the tent, after having stopped twice and changed direction twice, Smith knelt with his back and the rubber ground sheet to the drifting snow. Smith spoke into the mouth microphone. "This is Broadsword. Can I speak to Father McCree or Mother McCree? Over." "Sorry, unavailable." Over. "Code," Smith said. Over. "Ready." Smith extracted the paper from his pocket and shone his torch on it. There were 2 lines containing meaningless jumbles of letters, and below that the plain language translation, which read, "Safe landing. Harrod dead. Weather fine. Please await message 0800 GMT." Smith read off the corresponding code figures and finished off. Have that delivered to Father McCree by 0700, without fail. Torrance Smythe looked up at Smith's return. Back already? Surprise in his voice. You got through? Not a chance, Smith said disgustedly. Too many bloody mountains around. Didn't try for very long, did you? 2.5 minutes. It was Smith's turn to look surprised. Surely you know that's the safe maximum. You think there may be radio monitoring stations hereabout? Oh, no, not at all. Smith's voice was heavy with sarcasm. You wouldn't expect to find radio monitors in the Schloss Adler, would you now? Well, now, Torrance Smythe smiled tiredly. I believe someone did mention it was the southern HQ of the German Secret Service. Sorry, Major. My mind is so gummed up by cold and lack of sleep that I think it's stopped altogether. Smith pulled off his boots and snowsuit, climbed into his sleeping bag, and pulled the radio close to him. Then it's time you had some sleep. Go on, turn in. I'll keep watch. I'm wide awake. I know I won't sleep tonight. One downright lie, Smith thought, and one statement of incontrovertible truth. The pre-dawn greyness was in the sky. Smith and his men had broken camp. We leave in 10 minutes, he announced. Should give us plenty of time to be down in the tree line before sun-up, assuming there are no more cliffs. Back in a moment. Visibility's improving, and I think I'll go recce along the cliff edge. With any luck, maybe I can see the best way down. He pulled on his snowsuit and left, angling off in the direction of the cliff. As soon as he was beyond the belt of the scrub pines and out of sight of the camp, he changed direction uphill and broke into a run. A single eye appeared under a lifted corner of snow-covered canvas as Mary Ellison heard the soft crunch of running footsteps in the snow. Smith was standing above her. "Not already?" "Yes, already. Come on, up." "I haven't slept a wink." "We're off. Start in 5 minutes. Take some food, something to drink, that's all. And for God's sake, don't get too close to us." He glanced at his watch. "We'll stop at 7 a.m. Check your watch. Exactly 7 a.m. And don't bump into us." The slope of the Weißpitze was still very steep. Smith, with his 5 men strung out behind him in single file, slipped and stumbled almost constantly. 200 yards behind them, Mary Ellison carefully picked her way down the tracks made by the men below her. Some time later, Smith checked his watch again. It was exactly 7 o'clock. Smith stopped and held up his hand, waiting until the other 5 had caught up with him. "We must be halfway down now." He shrugged off the heavy pack on his back and lowered it gratefully into the snow. "I think it's time we had a look at the scenery." Directly opposite where they lay, and almost exactly on the same level, was the Schloss Adler itself. The Castle of the Eagle had been aptly named, an impregnable fortress, an inaccessible eyrie set between mountain and sky. Below the soaring northern ramparts of the castle, the valley fell away steeply to the Blaue See. From where they lay, they could see that the belt of pines in which they lay hidden extended almost all the way down to the lake. Getting down there unobserved would be no problem at all. A small village lay at the head of the lake. Basically, it consisted of a single wide street, perhaps 200 yards in length, a railway station, 2 inevitable churches perched on 2 inevitable knolls, and a thin scattering of houses climbing up the steep slopes on either side of the village. The road, just then, was completely blocked by snow, and sole access to the castle was obviously by means of the Luftseilbahn, an aerial cableway. 2 cables stretched from the village straight up to the castle. On the Blaue See, about a mile beyond the village, lay a very large group of regularly spaced huts arranged in rectangular patterns. It bore an uncommonly close resemblance to a military encampment. "This is terrible," Schäfer said, gloomily. They inched their way back to cover. Smith announced his intention of trying to contact London again. He unpacked the radio and sat down on a kit bag a few feet from the others. Smith cranked away diligently at intervals, then finally gave up and sat back, shaking his head in disgust. "You'll never make it with all those trees around," Torrance Smythe observed. "That must be it," Smith agreed. "I'll try the other side of the wood." He slung the transmitter over his shoulder and trudged to the other side of the belt of pines, followed the tracks uphill, whistling Lorelei. He stopped whistling when Mary appeared. "Hello, darling," she said brightly. "We'll have less of the darlings," Smith said briskly. "It's 8 a.m. Father McCrea waits." He cranked the handle and established contact almost immediately. "Father McCrea is waiting," the radio crackled. "Hold, hold." Smith held, and the unmistakable voice of Admiral Rolland took over. "Position, please, broadsword." Smith consulted the piece of paper in his hand. The message read, "Woods due west Castle, descending WH this evening." Smith read out the corresponding code letters. There was a pause, presumably while Rolland was having the message decoded. Then, "Understood. Proceed. Harrod killed accidentally? No. Over. By the enemy? Over. No. What is the weather report? Over. Deteriorating. Freshening winds strong later. Snow. Over." Smith said. "Time of next broadcast uncertain. Can you stand by? Over." "Am remaining HQ until operation complete," Rolland said. "Good luck. Goodbye." In the Naval Operations Room in Whitehall, Admiral Rolland and Colonel Wyatt Turner looked at each other with heavy faces. "So the poor devil was murdered," Wyatt Turner said flatly. Smith lit a cigarette and looked at the girl beside him. "Have you had a squint at the old Schloss yet?" "It's a fantastic place. How on earth did we ever get General Carnaby out of there?" "Easy. We'll take a walk up there tonight, get inside and take him away." Mary stared at him in disbelief. Finally she said, "That's all?" "You are going to open the door for me," Smith explained patiently. "You feeling all right?" "You're just the type they're looking for. Young, intelligent, good-looking. You can cook, polish, sew on Colonel Kramer's buttons." "Who's Colonel Kramer?" "Deputy Chief of the German Secret Service." Mary said with conviction, "You must be mad." "If I wasn't, I wouldn't be doing this job. Down in the village there's a gast house on the east side of the main street called Zum Wilden Hirsch, the wild deer. Remember it. Behind it there's a shed used as a beer cellar. It's always kept locked, but there will be a key in the door tonight. I'll meet you there at 8 o'clock. He walked away down the slope, leaving her looking after him. Lieutenant Schaffer lay stretched out with a telescope to his eye. He twisted as he heard Smith approaching on his hands and knees. "Couldn't you knock or something?" Schaffer asked irritably. "Sorry." Schaffer handed Smith the telescope. "Take a gander at this lot." Smith took the telescope. Schaffer suddenly cocked his head up to the sky in the direction of the unmistakably rackety whir of a helicopter engine. "Exit Schaffer," he announced hurriedly. "The bloodhounds are out for us." "I don't think so," Smith said. "Stay where you are and pull your smock over your head." The helicopter swept up the valley, still maintaining a course directly towards the spot where the two men lay hidden. Then, abruptly, when the helicopter was almost directly overhead, its side slipped sharply to its left, sank down over the castle courtyard, hovered for a few moments, and slowly descended. The helicopter had landed. The rotor stopped, steps descended, and a man climbed down to the courtyard floor. From his uniform, Smith decided, a very senior officer. His face tightened as he pushed the telescope across to Schaffer. Schaffer took a good look. "Pal of yours, boss?" "I know him. Reichsmarschall Julius Rosemeyer, the Wehrmacht Chief of Staff." "My very first Reichsmarschall, and me without my telescopic rifle," Schaffer said. "I wonder what His Highness wants." "Same as us," Smith said. "You don't think they might have come to take old Carnaby away?" Schaffer asked anxiously. "Not a chance. The Gestapo never gives up its prisoners. In this country, the Wehrmacht does what the Gestapo says." By early afternoon, snow had begun to fall from the darkened sky. It looked like being a bad night, Smith thought. But a bad night that reduced visibility to near zero and kept people indoors was what they wanted. Time to go. He climbed stiffly to his feet and beat his arms to restore circulation. "Call Thomas, will you?" Rucksacks and kit bags were slung and shouldered. Thomas, who had been keeping watch, appeared carrying Smith's telescope. "Is that damn radio working yet?" he asked Smith. "Not a hope. 6 tries, 6 failures. Why?" "I'll tell you why," Thomas said bitterly. "Pity we couldn't get the Admiral to change his mind about the paratroops. A full troop train just got in, that's all." "Well, that's fine," Smith said equably. "The old hands will think we're new boys, and the new boys will think we're old hands. Very convenient." Caracciolo said roughly, Why do we have to go down into that damned village? And how do you intend to get Carnaby out? If we're to commit suicide, tell us why. You owe us that." "I owe you nothing," Smith said flatly. "I'll tell you nothing." The village railway station was a small two-track end-of-the-line depot. It suited Smith's purpose perfectly. He led his 5 snow-smock-clad men quickly across the tracks and into the comparative shelter of the station buildings. Smith lowered the radio, shrugged off his rucksack, removed snow-smock and trousers, and sauntered casually along the tracks. He stopped outside a door next to a bolted hatch which bore above it the legend, "Gepäck annehmen." He took a bunch of oddly shaped keys from his pockets and had the door opened in seconds. He whistled softly and was almost at once joined by the others. Schaffer, bringing up the rear, glanced up at the sign above the hatch. "My God," he shook his head, "the left luggage office." "Where else?" Smith asked reasonably. He ushered Schaffer in, closed and locked the door behind him. "Let's go and have a drink." "Let's do that," Caracciolo said heavily. "Remind me to get mine down in one go, or 10 gets you one that I'll never live to finish it." "It would be a shame to waste good beer," Smith agreed. He waited until the last man was out, locked the door behind him. They were now no longer carrying rucksacks or wearing snow smocks. All were dressed in the uniforms of soldiers of a Jaeger battalion, Smith as a major, Schaffer as a lieutenant, and the other 4 as sergeants. There were no street lamps, but neither was there any attempt at a blackout. The main street, the only street, was deserted, quite empty of life. Inevitably so, on so bitter a night. But if the street was deserted, the village was anything but. The sounds of laughter and singing and the babel of voices filled the night air. Schaffer said plaintively, "I don't really feel like a drink, boss." "Nonsense," Smith said encouragingly. "You're just shy at the thought of meeting strangers." He stopped in front of a gasthouse with the legend "Dry Könige" above the door. "Here's a likely-looking place now. Hang on a minute." He climbed the steps, opened the door, and looked inside. Down in the street the other 5 looked at one another, the same mingled apprehension and expectancy mirrored in every eye. Smith shook his head, closed the door, and rejoined his man. "Packed," he said. "Not even standing room." He nodded across the street to another hostelry. "Let's see what this has to offer." Zum Wilden Hirsch, it was called, and above the sign was a snow-shrouded wooden carving of a wild deer. Smith walked up the half-dozen steps to the front door and opened it. Smith glanced at his men, nodded, and passed inside. As the others followed, Schaffer paused in the doorway as Christiansen took his arm and said wonderingly, "You think he thinks this isn't packed?" Smith transferred his attention from the room to the customers. 90% were soldiers of the German Alpenkorps, all giving of their very best with Lily Marlene, and nearly all of them waving their pewter-capped liter Steinbeckers. Behind the bar was the proprietor, a gargantuan 300-pounder with moon-like face and several girls filling trays with Steinbeckers. Several others moved about the room, collecting or serving beer mugs. One of them caught Smith's eye. She was dressed in a gaily patterned dirndl and Tyrolean blouse, had a hand-span waist, an hour-and-a-half glass figure, and an obvious predilection for low-cut blouses. "Can I help you, sir?" "Dark beer, please," Smith said politely. 6. "With pleasure, sir." A half-appraising, half-lingering look from cornflower blue eyes. Then she turned and walked away. Smith looked thoughtfully after the girl. Barmaids know more about what's going on in their own manor than any chief of police, and that one looks as if she might know more than most. Yes, I'll do that. "Do what?" Schaffer asked suspiciously. "Try to get next to her. When you get your drinks, circulate. See if you can hear any mention of Carnaby or Marshal Rosemare." He caught sight of the girl returning with 6 Steinbeckers. She gave drinks to Smith's men, who immediately began to wander away into different parts of the room. Smith put his arm around her waist and pulled her onto his knee. "And what might your name be, my Alpine Rose?" "Heidi." She struggled to rise, but didn't really put her heart into it. "Please, Major, I have work to do." "There is no more important work than entertaining soldiers of the fatherland," Smith said loudly. "Shall I sing you a song?" "What song?" Heidi asked warily. "I hear too much singing." I whistle better than I sing. Listen." He whistled, very softly, the first 2 bars of Lorelei. "Do you like that?" Heidi stiffened and stared, but immediately relaxed and smiled at him coquettishly. "It's very nice, Major." Smith said from behind his hand, "The men at the bar? The civilians? Don't turn round."
"Gestapo."
She made another apparently futile attempt to free herself.
"From the castle."
"One's a lip reader." Smith had the Steinbecker in front of his face again. "I can tell. They're watching. Your room in 5 minutes. Hit me good and hard." Heidi stared at him in bewilderment, then yelped in pain as he pinched her, far from gently. She drew back. Her right hand came over in a roundhouse swing, and the sound of the slap could be heard clearly across the crowded room, cutting sharply through the deep buzz of conversation. Heidi pushed herself to her feet, snatched up the note which Smith had earlier placed on the table, and stalked haughtily away. Smith, his already reddening face discomfited and tight in anger, made to leave the table, then halted when confronted by a Jaeger captain. "Your conduct does not become an officer of the Wehrmacht," he said loudly. When Smith's voice came, it was too quiet to be heard even at the next table. "Herr Major, when you talk to me, little man, Major Bernd Himmler. You may have heard of me? Report to me at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning." He swung away without waiting for an answer. He left Schaffer looking uncertainly after him and passed outside. He walked quickly up a narrow alleyway which paralleled Zum Wilden Hirsch. At the rear stood a small wooden hut. 8 o'clock, he said into the darkness. "Come on." Mary appeared in the doorway. She was shivering violently, her face blue-tinged with the extreme cold. Smith led her quickly to the back door of the Gasthaus. They climbed a flight of stairs and stopped at the second door on the right. It was a small, plainly furnished room. Mary sat down on the bed. "I hope you're enjoying your little game," she said bitterly. He pulled Mary to her feet and said, "Don't waste time. Take off your clothes. Every last stitch. Then get into that top outfit there. You'll find everything you need." Mary stared at him. "Those clothes? Why on earth must I—" "Don't argue now." "Now it is," she said resignedly. "You might at least turn your back." "Relax," Smith said wearily. "I have other things on my mind. Your name is Maria Schenk. You're from Dusseldorf, a cousin of a barmaid that works here, and you've had TB and been forced to give up your factory job and go to the mountains for your health. So you've got this new job, through this barmaid in the Schloss Adler. And you have identity papers, travel permit, references, and letters in appropriately postmarked envelopes to prove all of it. They're in that handbag in the case. Think you got all that?" I think so," she said uncertainly. "But if you'd only tell me—" "But it must have taken weeks to prepare those clothes, and those papers." "Like enough," Smith agreed. "Our forgery section did a very special job on those papers. Had to get you into the lion's den." "Weeks," Mary said incredulously. "But General Carnaby's plane crashed only yesterday morning." She stared at him. "You knew it was going to crash," Smith said cheerfully. "We rigged it." She snapped. "There really was a plane crash?" "Guaranteed." The plane crash-landed on the airfield HQ of the Bavarian Mountain Rescue Pilots, a place called Oberhausen, about 5 miles from here. The place we'll be leaving from, incidentally. "The place we'll be leaving—" She broke off. "And you'd risk the life of an American general? And all the plans for the Second Front?" Smith cleared his throat. "He's not an American general." "What? He's a plant?" "Name of Jones," Smith nodded. "Cartwright Jones, American actor, $25,000 for a one-night stand, the peak of his professional career." A soft double knock on the door. Heidi came in. "Well, cousins, here we are," he announced. "Mary, now Maria, and Heidi. I'm off." Mary looked uncertainly at the girl. "Heidi?" "Heidi, our top-secret agent in Bavaria since 1941. Smith opened the back door of the guest house, and, satisfied that he was unobserved, turned to the left, took 2 steps, and bit off an exclamation as he tripped over some unseen object. The already dulled and faded eyes of Torrance Smythe stared up at him in the sightless reproach of death. Back in the inn, Schaffer's voice was a low and vicious whisper. "Why, Torrance Smythe, he was the cleverest of us all." "That's why he's dead," Smith said somberly. "Now listen carefully. It's time you knew the score." Schaffer looked at him steadily and said, "It's more than time." Smith began to speak in a very low voice. After a minute or two, he saw Heidi returning to the room through the doorway behind the bar, but ignored her as she ignored him. Almost immediately afterwards, a gradual diminution in the babel of talk, followed by an almost complete silence, made him fall quiet himself. There was reason for the silence. Mary Ellison, clad in a belted raincoat, with a scarf over her head and a battered suitcase in her hand, was standing in the doorway.
"My dear Maria! My dear Maria! So you came after all! After all these years!"
Mary hugged the other girl and kissed her.
"It's wonderful to see you again, Cousin Heidi."
"Well," Heidi made no effort to lower her voice as she looked around significantly.
"They're a pretty rough lot hereabouts. You should carry a gun always. Hunter battalions, they call themselves. They're well named. Maria, this is Captain von Braukitsch. He, works in the Schloss Adler. Captain, my cousin, Maria Schenk."
Von Braukitsch bowed slightly.
"You are fortunate in your cousins, Heidi. We were expecting you, Miss Schenk," he smiled. "But not someone as beautiful as this."
Mary smiled in turn, her face puzzled.
"You were expecting?" "He was expecting," Heidi said dryly. "It is the captain's business to know what is going on."
"Don't make me sound so sinister, Heidi. You'll frighten Miss Schenk." He glanced at his watch.
"The next cable car leaves in 10 minutes, if I might escort the young lady."
"The young lady is going to my room first," Heidi said firmly, "for a wash-up and the cafe schnapps. Can't you see that she's half dead with cold?"
"I do believe her teeth are chattering," von Braukitsch said with a smile. "I thought it might have been me. Well, the cable car after the next one, then."
"And I'm going with her,"
Heidi announced.
"Both of you? My lucky night."
Heidi fished up some papers from the recesses of her Tyrolean blouse and handed them to Mary, who was sitting on the bed in her room. "Plan of the castle and instructions. Do your homework well, then give them back to me. I'll take them up. You might be searched." When Heidi returned to the bar, Smith and Schaffer had been rejoined by Carracciola, Thomas, and Christiansen. "You haven't seen old Smithy, then?" Smith asked quietly. "None of you saw him go? Then where in the hell has he got to?" Christiansen said, "Shall I go and have a look?" "I don't think so," Smith said. "I'm afraid it's too late to go anywhere now." Both doors of Zum Wilden Hirsch had suddenly burst open, and 6 soldiers were coming quickly in through either door. All had slung machine carbines, Schmeissers, at the ready.
"Colonel Weissner."
It required no acute ear to catch the shake in the proprietor's voice.
"What in God's name?" "No fault of yours, mein Herr."
The colonel's words were reassuring, which was more than the tone of his voice was.
"But you harbour enemies of the state."
"What? I? Joseph Wartman?"
"Please."
The colonel held up his hand for silence.
"We are looking for 4 or 5 Alpenquartizators from the Stuttgart military prison. To escape, they killed 2 officers and a guardroom sergeant. They were known to be heading this way."
Smith nodded and said in Schaffer's ear, very clever indeed."
"Now then," Weissner continued briskly, "if they're here, we'll soon have them. I want the senior officers present of drafts 13, 14, and 15 to come forward."
He waited until 2 majors and a captain came forward.
"You know all your officers and men by sight?"
The 3 officers nodded.
"Good. I wish you—"
"No need, Colonel."
Heidi had come round from behind the bar, and now stood before
"I know the man you're after, the ringleader."
"Ah," Colonel Weissner smiled. "The charming—"
"Heidi, Herr Colonel, I have waited table on you up in the Schloss Adler."
Weissner bowed. "As if one could ever forget."
"That one."
Heidi pointed a dramatically accusing finger at Smith.
"That's the one, Herr Colonel. He pinched me."
"My dear Heidi," Colonel Weissner smiled, "if we were to convict every man who ever harbored thoughts of—"
"Not that, Herr Colonel. He asked me what I knew or had heard about a man called General Carnaby, I think."
"General Carnaby?" Colonel Weissner was no longer smiling.
He glanced at Smith, motioned guards to close in on him, then glanced back at Heidi.
"What did you tell him?"
"Herr Colonel,"
Heidi was stiff with outraged dignity,
"I hope I am a good German, and I value my engagements at the Schloss Adler."
She half-turned and pointed across the room.
"Captain von Braukitsch of the Gestapo will vouch for me."
"No need."
He turned to Smith.
"Your accomplices, sir, and at once."
Mary, her face still and shocked, stared down from the uncurtained crack in Heidi's dark room, as Smith and the 4 others were led out of the front door of Zum Wilden Hirsch and bundled into 2 of the cars. For almost a minute afterwards she stood there, staring out unseeingly on the swirling snow, then pulled the curtains together and turned back towards the room. She said in a whisper,
"How did it happen?"
A match scratched as Heidi lit and turned up the flame of the oil lamp.
"I can't guess,"
Heidi shrugged.
"Someone I don't know who must have tipped Colonel Weissner off. But I put the finger on him."
Mary stared at her.
You... He'd have been found out in another minute anyway. They were strangers. But it strengthens our hand. I and you are now above suspicion."
There was no reply. Mary stared at the floor, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Heidi said softly,
"You love him as much as that?"
Mary nodded in silence. The big black Mercedes command car swept along the snow-packed road that paralleled the Blau See. Neither Schaffer up front nor Smith in the rear seat experienced any degree of comfort. Schmeisser machine pistols were grinding into the captive's sides. They were now, Smith estimated, halfway between village and barracks.
"Stop this car!"
Smith's voice was cold, authoritative, with an odd undertone of menace.
"Immediately, do you hear?"
Colonel Weissner, startled, turned and stared at him. Smith ignored him completely. His face reflected an intensely frowning concentration, a thin-lipped anger barely under control, the face of a man to whom the thought of disobedience of his curt instruction was unthinkable. Most certainly not the face of a man going to captivity and death. Weissner hesitated, but only fractionally. He gave an order, and the big car began to slow.
"You knew about this American General Carnaby?"
Smith's face was within 6 inches of Weissner's.
"How?" He spat the words out. "I dined in the Schloss Adler last night.
Smith looked at him in total incredulity.
"Colonel Paul Kramer told you? He actually talked to you about him?"
Weissner nodded wordlessly.
"Admiral Carnaby's chief of staff? And now everybody knows. God in heaven, heads will roll for this. Back to the barracks at once. I must get through to Berlin immediately. My uncle will know what to do."
"Your uncle?"
Weissner trembled.
"Heinrich Himmler?"
"Who do you think?" Smith snarled. "Mickey Mouse?"
The car moved off. Anything that the nephew of the dreaded Heinrich Himmler, chief of the Gestapo, said was good enough for the driver. Smith turned to the guard by his side.
"Take that damned thing out of my ribs."
Angrily, he snatched the gun away. The guard, who had also heard of Himmler, yielded up the machine pistol. 1 second later he was in helpless, retching agony as the butt of the Schmeisser smashed into his stomach, and another second later Colonel Weissner was pinned against the window of his Mercedes. Smith said, "If your men move, you die."
"Okay,"
Schaffer's calm voice from the front seat.
"I have the guns." "Stop the car," Smith ordered.
The car came to a halt.
"Out."
Weissner's face was a mask of rage, but he got out. 3 paces from the car, Smith said, face down in the snow. 20 seconds later, Schaffer at the wheel, they were on their way. At a steady 20 miles an hour they passed the main gates and then the secondary gates. Just behind the three-pointed star on the car's radiator flew a small triangular pennant, the camp commandant's personal standard, and no one would question the comings and goings of Colonel Weissner. At the end of the half-mile straight, the road ahead swept sharply to the right, to follow an indentation in the Blausee shoreline, a dangerous corner. Schaffer braked for the corner. A thoughtful expression crossed his face, and he applied still heavier pressure to the brake pedal and glanced at Smith. An excellent idea. It was Smith's turn to be approving. "We'll make an agent out of you yet." The Mercedes stopped. Smith gathered up the Schmeissers and pistols they had taken from Weissner and his men and got out. Schaffer wound down the driver's window, released the handbrake, engaged gear, and jumped out as the car began to move. The Mercedes went through the barrier as if it had been made of cardboard, shot out over the edge of the cliff, and disappeared from sight. "So who cares?" Schaffer straightened up from the fencing and shrugged his shoulders. "Wasn't our car. Back to the village, eh?" "Not on your life," Smith said emphatically, "and I mean that, literally. Come on, other way." Seconds later, Smith and Schaffer were off the road, hidden in the pines and moving slowly back in the direction of a command car and two armoured cars that had now pulled up at the broken barrier.
"That's it then, Herr Colonel."
An Alpencorps sergeant with shoulder-slung gun peered gingerly over the edge of the cliff.
"Going too fast, saw it too late, or never saw it at all."
Colonel Weissner's voice carried clearly and sounded bitter.
"They may have faked it and doubled back. Send one party of men straight into the pines there as far as the cliff wall, and be quick."
Schaffer, from his hiding place behind a pine, looked thoughtfully at Smith. "I have to concede a point, boss. It's perhaps as well we didn't go straight back to the village. Cunning old devil, isn't he?" "And what does that make me?" Smith murmured. Okay, I'll concede that point too." The cable car was a 12-passenger vehicle, painted bright red outside, well lit inside. There were no seats, only grab rails along the two sides. Apart from two soldiers and an apparent civilian, the only other passengers consisted of von Braukitsch, Mary, and Heidi. Von Braukitsch, holding onto the grab rail with one hand, had his free arm round Mary's shoulders. He gave them a reassuring squeeze and smiled down at her. "Scared?" he asked. "No." And she wasn't. She hadn't enough emotion left to be scared. But even with no hope left, she was supposed to be a professional. With a cupped cigarette in his hand, Schaffer leaned against the base of an unmistakable telephone pole and gazed thoughtfully into the middle distance. Smith was busily employed with a specially designed commando knife, which, among other features, had a built-in wire cutter. Carefully, he brought the wire cutter to bear. With 8 consecutive snips, 8 consecutive telephone wires fell to the ground. Smith slid down to the ground. He grinned at Schaffer. "Every little helps," he said. "Should hold them for a while," Schaffer agreed. Once more they gathered up their guns and moved off to the east, vanishing into the pine woods. Unexpected moonlight almost caught Smith and Schaffer. They had just crossed the station tracks and were moving stealthily along towards the left luggage office when the moon broke through. They pressed back into shadows and peered along the tracks, past the hydraulic bumpers which marked the end of the line. They could see one cable car approaching the lower station, the other climbing the last few vertical feet towards the header station, and above that, the dazzling outline of the Schloss Adler. "That helps," Schaffer said bitterly. "That helps a lot." "Sky's still full of clouds," Smith said mildly. He bent to the keyhole of the left luggage office, used his skeleton keys, and moved inside. Schaffer followed. Smith located their rucksacks, cut a length of rope from the nylon, wrapped it round his waist, and began stuffing some hand grenades and plastic explosives into a canvas bag. Schaffer cleared his throat. "Boss?" "Uh-huh." "Boss, has it occurred to you that Colonel Weissner probably knows all about this cache by this time? We may have company soon." "We may indeed," Smith admitted. "That's why I've cut this itsy-bitsy piece of rope off the big coil and why I'm taking the explosives and grenades only from my rucksack and yours. It's a very big coil, and no one knows what's inside our rucksacks, so it's unlikely that anything will be missed. But the radio... If we broadcast from here, we might be caught in the act. If we take it away and they find it gone, they'll know that the car at the bottom of the Blausee is empty. Is that it? More or less. So we compromise. We remove it, but we return it here after we've broadcast from a safe place. What do you mean, safe place? Schaffer demanded plaintively. He tossed Schaffer a bunch of skeleton keys. Ever been inside a Bavarian lady's cloakroom? Slowly, with apparently infinite labour, the cable car completed the last few feet of its ascent and passed in under the roof of the Schloss Adler header station. It juddered to a halt, the front door opened, and the passengers disembarked. Mary turned to von Brauchitsch, still holding a proprietary grip on her arm, and smiled ruefully.
So many soldiers, so many men, and I'm sure so few women. What happens if I want to escape from the licentious soldiery?
The ladies' cloakroom in the station was bleakly furnished. Smith was seated by the central table, radio beside him, consulting a small book by the light of a hooded pencil flash, and writing on a slip of paper. He checked what he had written and handed the book to Schaffer. Burn it, page by page. Page by page, all? Surprise in the saturnine face. You won't be requiring this any more? Smith shook his head and began to crank the radio handle. The civilian operator spoke into his microphone. We hear you, over. Code, ready, over. Ready, over. Torrance Smythe murdered. Thomas Christiansen and Caracciola captured. Enemy believe Schaffer and self dead, the message continued. Effecting entry inside the hour. Please have transport standing by 90 minutes. Over. Admiral Roland seized the microphone from the operator. Broadsword, broadsword, you know who I am, broadsword. I know who you are, sir. Over. Pull out, broadsword, pull out now. Save yourselves. Over. Mary is already inside. Over and out. The transceiver went dead. Operation Overlord, Roland murmured. We can write that off. Intelligence is the fast arm of modern warfare, Wyatt Turner said bitterly. Or has someone said that before? No intelligence, no war. Admiral Roland pressed an intercom button. Have my car brought round. Coming, Colonel, to the airfield? And a lot further than that, if I have your permission, sir. We've discussed it. Admiral Roland shrugged. I understand how you feel. Kill yourself if you must. Smith switched off the transmitter. You heard what the man said. We can pull out now. Pull out now? Schaffer was outraged. Don't you realize that if we do, they'll get to Mary inside 12 hours? And if they get to her, they're bound to get to Heidi 10 minutes later. Come off it, Lieutenant, Smith said. You've only seen her once, for 5 minutes. So? Schaffer was looking positively belligerent. How often did Paris see Helen of Troy? And I don't care if she is a traitor. She was born and brought up in Birmingham, Smith said wearily. So who cares? I draw the line at nothing. Even if she is a limey. He paused. English? Come on, Smith said. Let's return this radio. We may have callers soon. They returned the radio, locked the left luggage office, and were just moving towards the station exit when they were halted by the sound of truck engines. They pressed back against a wall as headlights lit up the station entrance. The two men moved swiftly alongside the tracks and hid in the deep shadows behind the booking office. A sergeant located the left luggage office, shot away the lock, and passed inside, torch in hand. He appeared at the doorway almost at once. "Tell the captain they didn't lie. The Englander's gear is here." "There goes my last pair of cotton socks," Schaffer murmured mournfully as their rucksacks were taken away. He broke off as Smith caught his arm. The sergeant had stopped the man carrying the radio, placed his hand on it, and stood quite still. "Capitan!" the sergeant shouted. "Capitan!" An officer came hurrying through the station entrance. "The radio, Capitan, it's warm, very warm. It's been in use inside the last 5 minutes. "In the last 5 minutes? Impossible." He stared at the sergeant. "Unless—" "Yes, Herr Capitan, unless—" "Surround the station," the officer shouted. "Search every room." "Oh, God," Schaffer moaned. "Why can't they leave us alone?" "Quickly," Smith said softly. He took Schaffer's arm, and they moved through the dark shadows till they reached the ladies' cloakroom. The German captain was barking out his commands. "Shoot on sight and shoot to kill!" "You heard?" Smith said. "I'm afraid I did." There was a perceptible click as Schaffer cocked his machine pistol. They stood side by side in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the search, the calling of voices, the hammering of rifle butts on wood. The sounds of the approaching search grew very close. "What do we do, boss?" Schaffer said quietly. "We create a diversion. Here are the keys. This one. Put it in the lock and hold it ready to turn. We'll be leaving in a hurry." He dug into his knapsack, fished out a hand grenade, crossed the cloakroom into the washroom. With infinite caution, he thrust his head through the window. Nobody blew his head off. There were soldiers immediately to be seen, soldiers armed and at the ready, waiting for the rabbits to bolt, Smith thought. What was of much more interest was the empty truck parked only feet away from the window. Smith armed the grenade, counted 3, lobbed it under the back wheels of the truck, and ducked behind the shelter of the washroom wall. The 2 explosions, grenade and petrol tank, went off so almost simultaneously as to be indistinguishable in time. On hands and knees, Smith scuttled across the washroom floor. Schaffer, who had his hand on the key and the door already open a fraction, turned at Smith's approach. "To the hills, boss?" he inquired. "To the hills." The trackside of the station was, predictably, deserted. They ran along the tracks till they were safely among the scatter of houses that rose steeply up the hillside. They stopped and looked back. The station was on fire. Schaffer said, "They're not going to be very pleased." "As you would say," Smith reminded him. "It wasn't our station to start with. We'll go see what kind of reception awaits us at the Schloss Adler." Mary Ellison was just at that moment discovering what the reception in the Schloss Adler was like. "Good evening, Anne-Marie," von Brauchitsch said. There was a marked lack of cordiality in his voice. "This is the new girl, Fräulein Maria Schenk. Maria, this is the Colonel's secretary in charge of all female staff." "Took your time about getting here, didn't you, Schenk?" She turned to Heidi and gave her an icy up and down. "And why you? Just because we let you wait table when the Colonel has company?" "Heidi is the girl's cousin," von Brauchitsch interrupted brusquely, "and she has my permission." "In here, Schenk." Anne-Marie nodded to a side door. "I have a few questions to ask." Mary looked at Heidi, then at von Brauchitsch, who shrugged and said, "Routine investigation, Fräulein. I'm afraid you must." Mary preceded Anne-Marie through the doorway. Within half a minute, the reason for von Brauchitsch's helpless gesture became obvious. Through the door there came first the sound of a raised voice, a brief scuffle, then a sharp cry of pain. Von Brauchitsch exchanged another resigned glance with Heidi, then turned as he heard heavy footsteps behind him. The man approaching was burly, weather-beaten, middle-aged, and in civilian clothes. "Good evening, Colonel Kramer." "Evening, Captain. Evening, Fräulein." He had an unexpectedly gentle and courteous voice. "You wear an air of expectancy?" Before either could answer, the door opened and Anne-Marie and Mary entered. Mary gave the impression of having been pushed into the room. "We'll have no more trouble with her," Anne-Marie announced with satisfaction. She caught sight of Kramer, and the change in her tone was perceptible. "Interviewing new staff, Colonel." "In your usual competent fashion, I see," Colonel Kramer said dryly. He shook his head. "When will you learn that respectable young girls do not like being forcibly searched?" "Security regulations," Anne-Marie said. Yes, Kramer's voice was brusque. "But there are other ways." He turned away impatiently. "A little excitement in the village tonight?" "Nothing for us," von Brauchitsch shrugged. "Deserters." Kramer smiled. "That's what I told Colonel Weissner to say. I think our friends are British agents." "What?" "After General Carnaby, I shouldn't wonder," Kramer said carelessly. "Relax, Captain, it's over. 3 of them are coming up for interrogation within the hour." "There were 5 of them, sir. I saw them myself when they were rounded up in zum Wildenhirsch." "There were 5, Colonel Kramer corrected. "Not now. 2 of them, the leader and 1 other, are in the Blaue Sea. They went over a cliff." Mary, her back to the men and Anne-Marie, smoothed down her dress and slowly straightened. Her face was stricken. Anne-Marie turned, saw Mary's curiously immobile position, and was moving curiously towards her when Heidi took Mary's arm and said quickly, "My cousin looks ill. May I take her to her room?"
"All right."
Anne-Marie waved her hand in curt dismissal.
"The room you use when you are here."
The room was bleak, monastic. "You heard?" Mary said emptily. Her face was as drained of life as her voice.
"I heard, and I don't believe it." "Why should they lie?" "They believe it."
Heidi's tone was impatient, almost rough.
"It's time you stopped loving and started thinking. The Major Smiths of this world don't drive over cliff edges."
"Talk is easy, Heidi."
"Now then,"
Heidi went on briskly. She reached first under her skirt, then down the front of her blouse, and laid 7 objects on the table.
"Here we are. Lilliput, .21 automatic, 2 spare magazines, ball of string, lead weight, plan of the castle, and the instructions."
She crossed to a corner of the room, raised a loose floorboard, placed the articles beneath it, and replaced the board.
"They be safe enough here."
Mary looked at her for a long moment, and showed her first spark of interest in an hour.
"You knew that board was loose," she said slowly. "Of course. I loosened it myself a fortnight ago." "You? You knew about this as far back as then?"
"Whatever else?" Heidi smiled.
"Good luck, cousin."
Mary sank onto the bed after Heidi had gone, then rose wearily to her feet. She opened her window and leaned out. To the left and below, a cable car left the castle header station and started to move down to the valley below. Heidi was in that car, leaning out of a partially open window and hopefully waving, but Mary's eyes had again blurred with tears, and she did not see her. She closed the window, and she wondered again about the significance of that fire in the valley below. Smith and Schaffer skirted the backs of the houses, shops, and Weinstuben on the east side of the street, keeping to the dark shadows as far as it was possible. They came to one of the few stone buildings in the village, a large barn-like affair with double doors at the back. Schaffer used skeleton keys to effect, and they were inside, doors closed and both torches on inside 15 seconds. The floor space was occupied by a variety of vehicles, mostly elderly. What caught and held Smith's immediate attention, however, was a big yellow bus parked just inside the double front doors. It was a typically Alpine post bus. Smith looked at Schaffer. "Promising, you think?" "If I was optimistic enough to think we'd ever get back to this place," Schaffer said sourly, "I'd say it was very promising. You knew about this?" "What do you think I am, a bus diviner? Of course I knew. Leave half the explosives in the back of the bus, and hurry. Heidi might be down with the next car." The snow had stopped, but the wind from the west was now very strong. A cable car was coming slowly down the valley. Heidi, the only passenger, climbed out. Understandably enough, she was looking rather pale. She heard the softly whispered first few notes of Lorelei. She whirled round, then slowly approached 2 shapes, clad all in white, huddled by the side of the station.
"The Major Smiths of this world don't drive off cliff tops," she said calmly.
She paused, then stepped forward suddenly and gave each man a quick hug and kiss on the cheek. "You just keep on worrying like that," Schaffer said. "No need to worry about him, though." Heidi waved a hand in the direction of the fire.
"Are you responsible for this?" she asked.
"It was a mistake," Smith explained. "Yeah, his hand slipped," Schaffer added.
"You two should audition for a turn on vaudeville,"
Heidi said dryly.
"Mary thinks you're both gone."
"Weisner doesn't," Smith said. "The car that went over the cliff went without us. They're on to us."
"Hardly surprising," she murmured. "Or hadn't you noticed the size of the fire?"
She paused, then went on bleakly.
"They're not the only ones who are on to you. Kramer knows you're British agents after General Carnaby."
Well, well, well," Smith said thoughtfully. "I wonder what little bird has been whispering in Kramer's ear, one with a very long-range voice."
"What are you talking about?"
"It's not important."
"It's not important, but don't you see?" Her voice was imploring. "They know, or will any minute, that you're alive. They know who you are. They be expecting you up there."
"Ah, but you overlook the subtleties, my dear Heidi," Schaffer put in. "What they don't know is that we are expecting them to be expecting us. At least, that's what I think I mean."
"You're whistling in the dark, Lieutenant. And one last thing, your friends are being brought up to the castle any time now."
"For interrogation?" Smith asked.
"I don't expect they've been asked up for tea," she said acidly.
"Fair enough," Smith nodded. "We'll go up with them."
"In the same car?"
The words didn't question Smith's sanity, but the tone and the expression did. "Not in, with." Smith peered at his watch. "The post bus in Sulz's garage. Be there in 80 minutes. And oh, bring a couple of crates of empty beer bottles."
"Bring a couple of... Oh, all right."
She shook her head in conviction.
"You're both mad."
The seconds crawled by and became minutes. They waited because they had to. They couldn't reach the Schloss Adler without company, and company was a long time in coming. And they waited in silence, each man alone with his own thoughts. 2 Alpenkorps command cars, the leading one with wailing siren and flashing headlamps, swept up the village street just as the moon broke through the cloud rack. Mary walked slowly along the dimly lit, stone-flagged passage, counting off doors as she went. Outside the 5th, she stopped, put her ear to it, stooped, glanced through the keyhole, knocked quietly, and waited for a response. There was none. She produced a set of skeleton keys. When the door yielded, she slipped quickly inside, closed the door, and switched on the light. Mary locked the door, crossed the room, lifted the lower sash window, and looked down. She withdrew her head, removed from her handbag a ball of string with a heavy bolt attached to one end, laid it on the bed, picked up the binoculars, and took up station by the window. She adjusted the focus of the field glasses, then traversed down the line of the aerial cables. And then she had it, dimly seen but unmistakable, the squat black outline of the cable car. Smith and Schaffer lay stretched out on the roof, clutching desperately to the suspension bracket, the only anchorage available. Schaffer twisted his head, peered downwards, screwed his eyes shut, lowered his head between his outstretched arms, and moaned. "Still think the horse the world's worst form of transport?" Smith asked. His lips were close to Schaffer's ear. "Suits her, doesn't it?" Schaffer said suddenly. "A lovely name." "What are you talking about?" Smith demanded. "Heidi." "Oh, my God." Smith stared up at the rapidly closing header station. "Her name is Ethel." "You didn't have to tell me." Schaffer tried to sound aggrieved, but it didn't quite come off. Smith eased his knife from its sheath and made a quick grab at the suspension bracket as a particularly violent swing almost broke his grip with his other hand. "Get your knife ready, and for God's sake don't lose it." The front of the car passed under the lip of the header station roof. A moment later the suspension bracket followed, and Smith lunged forward and upwards, flinging himself bodily onto the roof. His right arm struck downwards, and the knife blade pierced the coating of ice and embedded itself firmly in the wood beneath. Less than a second later, Schaffer had landed beside him, the downward arcing knife making contact at exactly the same instant as himself. The blade broke off at the hilt. Schaffer opened his hand, dropped the haft, and clawed desperately at the ice. Smith had been badly winded by his fall. Several seconds elapsed before he realized that Schaffer wasn't where he should have been, lying on the roof beside him. He brought his left hand flashing down with a speed and power that even in those circumstances made Schaffer grunt in pain as the vice-like grip clamped over his right wrist. For some seconds they lay like that, spread-eagled and motionless on the sloping roof, the lives of both dependent on the slim embedded blade of Smith's knife. Then Schaffer, urged by Smith's quivering left arm, began to inch his way slowly upwards. 30 seconds later, and he was level with Smith and safe. 50 feet above their heads, Mary began to pay out the weighted string.
Brother, Schaffer mopped his brow some more. If I can ever do you a favour, like lending you a car fare.
Smith grinned, clapped his shoulder, reached up into the gloom, caught the weighted end of the suspended string and quickly bent the nylon onto it. He gave 2 gentle tugs, and the rope began to move upwards as Mary hauled it in through the window. Smith waited until 2 more gentle return tugs indicated that the rope was securely fastened, and began to climb. 25 feet below him, Schaffer peered cautiously over the edge of the header station roof. The guards and dogs were still patrolling the area around the base of the volcanic plug. Smith reached the window, clambered over the sill, gave the rope 2 tugs as a signal for Schaffer to start climbing, and passed into the room. Mary was still clinging to him when Lieutenant Schaffer made his appearance, dragging himself wearily over the sill and collapsing on the iron bedstead.
"Have they no elevators in this dump?" he demanded.
"Out of training," Smith said.
"Damn. Get the rope in, then pull the curtains." "This is the way they treated them in the Roman galleys," Schaffer said bitterly.
But he had the rope inside and the curtains closed in 10 seconds. He had just finished tying the neck of the bag when a key scraped in the lock. The door opened, and a young Oberleutnant strode into the room, stopping short as he saw Mary. His face registered an astonishment almost immediately replaced by an anticipatory half-smile as he stepped forward beyond the opened door. Smith's arm came down, and the young officer's eyes turned up in his head. Smith studied the plans of the castle, given him by Mary, while Schaffer trussed up the Oberleutnant.
"Ready when you are, boss."
"That's now. I have my bearings. First left down the stairs, third left. The gold drawing room, where Colonel Kramer holds court. Then the next right-hander takes us to the east wing. Down again, second left, telephone exchange."
"Why there?" Schaffer asked. "We've already cut the lines."
"Not the ones between here and the barracks, we haven't. Want them to whistle up a regiment of Alpenkorps?" He turned to Mary. "Helicopter still here?" "It was when I arrived." Schaffer showed his puzzlement.
"What gives with the whirlybird, then?"
"This gives with the whirlybird. They could use it either to whip Carnaby out of here, or they might use it to block our getaway. If we get away. There's that. How are you on immobilizing helicopters, Lieutenant Schaffer?" Schaffer said, "Give me a 4-pound hammer and I'll sure immobilize anything from a bulldozer to a bicycle." "And without the 4-pounder? This is not a Boilermaker's convention."
"I have been known to use finesse."
"Seems a straightforward operation," Schaffer said. "Fixing it so that the chopper doesn't fly again, I mean."
"I cross to the main gates, overpower the 4 men on guard, strangle the 4 Doberman pinchers, knock off 2 or 3 other characters, armed characters, who appear to be patrolling the place all the time, overpower about 20 soldiers who appear to be drinking beer in some sort of canteen across the way."
"We'll think of something," Smith said soothingly.
"I'll bet you think of something," Schaffer said moodily. "That's what I'm afraid of."
Smith folded the plan, handed it to Mary, then frowned as she put it in her bag.
"You know better than that. The lilliput. It should be on your person, not in the bag. Here."
He handed her the Mauser he'd taken from Colonel Weissner. "This in your bag. Hide the lilliput on you." "When I get to my room, I will," she said primly.
"All those leering Yankee lieutenants around," Schaffer said sadly. "Thank heavens I'm a changed man."
Smith glanced at his watch. "Give us 30 minutes. They slipped cautiously through the doorway, then strode briskly and confidently along the passage. The bag with the schmeisers, rope, grenades, and explosives Smith swung carelessly from one hand. They passed a bespectacled soldier carrying a sheaf of papers, and a girl carrying a laden tray, neither of whom paid any attention to them. They reached a circular flight of stairs, and went down 3 floors to the level of the courtyard. A short, broad passage, with 2 doors on either side, took them to the main door leading out to the courtyard. Smith opened the door and looked out. The overall mechanic was still at work on the helicopter's engine. Smith quietly closed the door and turned his attention to the nearest right-hand door in the passage. It was locked. He said to Schaffer, "Keep an eye open at the end of the passage there." Smith brought out skeleton keys. He signalled Schaffer to return. With the door locked behind them, they looked around the room. It was, quite apparently, the firefighting HQ of the castle. The walls were hung with drums of rolled hoses, asbestos suits, helmets and fire axes, wheeled hand pumps, CO2 cylinders. "Ideal," Smith murmured. "If we leave anyone in here, he's unlikely to be discovered unless there's an actual outbreak of fire." "Agreed? So." He took Schaffer by the arm and led him to the window. "The lad working on the chopper there, take your jacket off and keep your Luger lined up on that door. I'll be back in a minute." Smith walked briskly to the chopper.
"You the pilot?" Smith asked. "You wouldn't think so, would you?" the overalled man said bitterly. He laid down a spanner and blew on his hands. "What do you want?"
"Not me. Reich Marshal Rosemeyer. The phone."
"The Reich Marshal?" The pilot was puzzled. "I was speaking to him less than 15 minutes ago."
Smith stood aside as the pilot clambered down, looked casually around. A guard with a leashed Doberman was no more than 20 feet away, but paying no attention to them. Smith turned to follow the pilot through the main door, unobtrusively unholstering his Luger and gripping it by the barrel. Smith hadn't intended chopping down the pilot with his gun butt, but was left with no option. As soon as the pilot had passed through the side door and seen Schaffer's Luger pointing at his chest from a distance of 4 feet, his shoulders lifted, the preliminary, Smith knew, not to violence or resistance, but to a shout for help. Schaffer caught him as he pitched forward and lowered him to the floor. Quickly, they unzipped the overall from the unconscious man, bound and gagged him, and left him lying in a corner. Smith switched off the light, unshuttered the window, raised the lower sash and stood, Luger in hand. Schaffer was already climbing the steps up to the helicopter. The guard was flailing his arms across his shoulders in an attempt to keep warm. 30 seconds later, Schaffer climbed down the ladder again, carrying some piece of equipment in his left hand. "That was quick," Smith said approvingly. "Fear lent him wings, as the saying goes," Schaffer said sourly. "Distributor cap. I'll bet they haven't another in Bavaria, not for that engine. And now I suppose you want me to go and impersonate the telephone operator." "Soon. But I'd like to check first how far they've got with old Carnaby Jones. Let's take a look." 2 floors higher up, and midway along the central passage, Smith stopped outside a doorway. At a nod from him, Schaffer reached for a light switch. Except for a faint glow of light at either end, the passage was now completely dark. Smith laid a gentle hand on the doorknob and quietly eased the door open. 15 inches, no more. Both men swiftly slid through the narrow gap, Smith quickly and softly closing the door to again. They stood, not on the floor, but on a platform some dozen feet above the floor. It was a massive and grotesquely carved oaken minstrel's gallery, which completely spanned the 30-foot width of that end and ran perhaps a quarter of the way down both the longer sides of the room. Everything in it was gold or golden or gilt. The enormous wall-to-wall carpet was deep gold in colour. The thickness of the pile would have turned a polar bear green with envy. The heavy Baroque furniture, all twisted snakes and gargoyles' heads, was gilt. The huge couches and chairs covered in a dusty gold lame. All in all, Smith reflected, it was a room only a mad Bavarian monarch could have conceived of, far less lived in. Three men were seated comfortably round the great fire, to all appearances having an amicable discussion over after-dinner coffee and brandy, which was being served to them from a golden trolley by Anne-Marie. The man with his back to him Smith had never seen before, but because he immediately recognized who the other men were, knew who this man must be. Colonel Paul Kramer, Deputy Chief of the German Secret Service, regarded by MI6 as having the most brilliant and formidable brain in German intelligence. Colonel Kramer looked first at the man on his left, a tall, aging, good-looking man in the uniform of a Reich Marshal of the Wehrmacht, and then at the man seated opposite, an iron-grey-haired and very distinguished-looking character in the uniform of a Lieutenant General of the U.S. Army. In the gloom at the back of the minstrel's gallery, Schaffer nudged Smith with his elbow. "What gives with old Carnaby Jones knocking back the Napoleon, then?" he asked in a low, indignant murmur. "Why isn't he being turned on a spit?" "Shh!" Smith's nudge carried a great deal more weight and authority than Schaffer's had done. Jones continued. "Have you forgotten, General Rosemeyer, that Germany is also a signatory to the Hague Conventions?" "I haven't forgotten," Rosemeyer said. "And if I had my way, General, my hands are tied. I have my orders from Berlin." "And you can tell Berlin all they're entitled to know," Jones said easily. "I am Lieutenant General George Carnaby, United States Army." "And Chief Coordinator of Planning for the Second Front," Rosemeyer added morosely. "The Second Front?" Jones asked with interest. "What's that?" Rosemeyer said heavily and with earnest gravity, "General, I've done all I can. You must believe me. For 36 hours now I've held off Berlin." "General George Carnaby," Jones said calmly, "United States Army." "I expected nothing else," Rosemeyer admitted. "I'm afraid the matter is now in Colonel Kramer's hands." Jones eyed Kramer. "The Colonel doesn't seem very happy about it." "I'm not," Kramer said, "but the matter is out of my hands too. I also have my orders. Anne-Marie will attend to the rest of it." "This charming young lady?" Jones was politely incredulous. "A maestro of the thumbscrew?" "Of the hypodermic syringe," Kramer said shortly. A bell rang and Kramer picked up a phone. "Yes? Very good. Now." He looked across at Jones. "Some interesting company coming, General. Parachutists. A rescue team for you. I'm sure you'll be delighted to meet one another." "I really can't imagine what you're talking about," Jones said idly. "The rescue team we've seen before," Smith murmured to Schaffer. "And no doubt we'll be renewing old acquaintances before long. Come on." The two men left as quietly as they had come. They walked briskly along the passage, dropped down a flight of stairs, halted outside a doorway which bore above it the legend, "Telephone Central." The door was locked. "Suspicious bunch of devils," Schaffer said. "The skeletons." The operator would hear us. Next door. Next door wasn't locked. Smith looked to his right. The lighted window of the telephone exchange was only a few feet away. From the window, a heavy lead-sheathed cable attached to a wire almost equally as heavy stretched down the castle wall into the darkness. "That the one?" Schaffer was by his side now. "That's the one. Let's have the rope." Smith eased his legs into a double bowline, wriggled over the windowsill, and cautiously lowered himself. He grasped cable and wire firmly with his left hand, inserted the point of his knife between cable and wire a few inches below that, and started sawing. A dozen powerful saw cuts, and he was through. Mary opened her handbag, checked that the safety catch of the Mauser inside was in the off position, closed the bag, and crossed the room. Knuckles rapped on the outside. The door opened, and a cheerfully smiling von Braukitsch stood framed in the doorway. "Ah, Fraulein!" He glanced at the bag and smiled again. "Lucky me, just in time to escort you wherever you're going. You and I have a lot to talk about." "We have?" It was impossible to resist the infectious smile, not to reply in kind. "Such as?" "Dusseldorf." "Dusseldorf?" "Of course, that's my hometown, too." She wondered vaguely, as she walked along, how one could smile, and inside feel as chilled as the tomb. This time Smith and Schaffer did not remain at the back of the minstrel's gallery. They moved slowly to the front, till they had come to the head of the broad flight of stairs leading down to the floor of the gold room, and then sat on the front oaken benches. Colonel Kramer's stock of VSOP Napoleon brandy was taking a beating that night, Smith reflected. The Colonel, Reich Marshal Rosemeyer, Jones, and Anne-Marie had been joined by 3 others. Carracciola, Thomas, and Christiansen. Those last three were no longer manacled. Anne-Marie now held a glass in her hand. It appeared to be an occasion for a celebration of some note. Kramer lifted his glass towards the three men seated on the couch.
"Your health, gentlemen, your very good health," he turned to the Rash Marshal. "Three of the best in Europe, sir."
"Double agents." In his contempt, Jones almost spat out the words. Kramer smiled and turned to the three men on the couch.
"And the return trip, gentlemen, as well organized as your outward journey?"
"That's about the only thing the closed-mouthed so-and-so told us," Carracciola said with some bitterness. "A mosquito bomber is to come to pick us up. Salem, a little village north of Frauenfeld in Switzerland. There's a little civilian airfield just to the north of Salem." Schaffer bent across the passage again and said in an admiring whisper, "You really are a fearful liar."
"So Salem it is," Kramer was saying. "You will be back in Whitehall reporting General Carnaby's transfer to Berlin before you know it."
"Back in London?" Thomas shook his head in slow emphasis. "Not on your Nelly, Colonel, with Smith and that yank still at large?"
"What do you take us for?" Kramer said tiredly. "You will also, of course, be reporting the unfortunate demise of your leader. One of the searchers had the original idea of examining the roof of the cable car itself, and sure enough—" "They're inside?" Christiansen exclaimed.
"And won't get out again." Colonel Kramer leaned back comfortably in his chair. Jones glared at Carracciola, Christiansen, and Thomas, and said very slowly and distinctly, "You bloody swine." "Against all my principles, General Carnaby," Rosemeyer said uncomfortably, "but if we could only dispense with force—" "Principles, you make me sick." Jones stood up and made a strangled noise in his throat. He stripped off his uniform jacket, rolled up a sleeve, and sat down again. There was a brief and uncomfortable silence. Then Kramer nodded to Anne-Marie, who put down her glass and moved off to a side door leading off the gold drawing-room. Smith and Schaffer adjusted the straps of their shoulder-slung schmeisers until the machine pistols were in the horizontal position, then started slowly down the stairs. They were halfway down, just beginning to emerge from the dark gloom of the gallery, when Anne-Marie re-entered the room. She was carrying a small stainless steel tray. Anne-Marie carefully filled the hypodermic syringe and held it up to the light to examine it. Smith and Schaffer continued to advance, their footfalls soundless on the luxuriously deep pile of the gold carpet. The hypodermic hovered over the swabbed area as she located the vein she wanted. "Just a waste of good scopolamine, my dear," Smith said. "You won't get anything out of him." Colonel Kramer was the first to react. Almost imperceptibly, his hand began to drift to a button on a panel beside his chair. "That button, Colonel," Smith said conversationally. Slowly, reluctantly, Kramer's hand retreated from the button. "On the other hand," Smith went on cordially, "why not? By all means, if you wish." Kramer glanced at him in narrow-eyed and puzzled suspicion. "You will notice, Colonel," Smith continued by way of explanation, "that my gun is not pointing at you. It is pointed at him." He swung his gun to cover Carracciola. "At him." The gun moved to Thomas. "At him." It covered Christiansen. "And at him." Smith swung round abruptly and ground the muzzle of the Schmeiser into Schaffer's ribs. "Drop that gun, now." "Drop the gun?" Schaffer stared at him in shock and baffled consternation. "What in the name of God—" Smith stepped swiftly forward, and without altering his grip on his gun, lifted the barrel sharply upwards and drove the butt of the Schmeiser into Schaffer's stomach. The contempt in Smith's voice gave way to menace. "That chair, Schaffer!" Schaffer lowered himself with difficulty into his chair. Smith settled himself comfortably in a chair beside Colonel Kramer. "A simple-minded American," he explained carelessly. "Had him along for local color." "I see," Kramer said. It was obvious that he did not see. He went on uncertainly. "If we might have an explanation—" Smith smiled. "As I was saying, scopolamine is a waste of time. The truth about our friend is that he is not Lieutenant General George Carnaby, Chief Coordinator of Planning for the Second Front, but a certain Cartwright Jones. an American actor being paid precisely $25,000 to impersonate General Carnaby. Kramer and Rosemary were on their feet, the others leaning far forward on the couch, an almost exactly identical expression of disbelief showing in every face. "Well, well, well," Smith said with interest. "Surprise, surprise, surprise." He tapped Kramer on the arm and gestured in the direction of Carracciola, Thomas, and Christiansen. "Odd, wouldn't you say, Kramer? They seem just as astonished as you are." "Is this true?" Rosemary demanded hoarsely of Jones. "What he says, do you deny?" In a voice that was no more than a whisper, Jones said, How in God's name? Who are you, sir?" "A stranger in the night," Smith waved a hand.
"Don't listen to him, Colonel Kramer, don't listen to him!"
Carracciola shouted wildly.
"It's a bluff! He's just trying—"
Smith lined up his gun on Carracciola's chest and went on tiredly. "Colonel Kramer, I don't fancy talking and having to keep a gun on this unlovely trio all the time. Have you a guard you can trust?" Kramer looked at him for a very long moment and reached for a phone. The armory, now converted into a Kaffeestube, of the Schloss Adler, was very much in keeping with the remainder of the castle. Something out of a medieval dream or nightmare, according to how individual tastes and inclinations lay.
"Well, what did I tell you?" von Brauchitsch said expansively. "Coffee to match the surroundings."
Mary said, "What did those men want? They seem to be looking for someone."
"Forget them. Concentrate on von Brauchitsch."
"But you spoke to them. What did they want?"
"They said there are spies in the castle." Von Brauchitsch laughed. "Imagine spies in the Schloss Adler, the Gestapo HQ."
The company in the gold drawing-room had now been increased by one, a tall, hard-eyed sergeant who held a carbine. He was standing behind the couch on which Carracciola, Thomas, and Christiansen were seated, and he was giving them his entire attention, apart from a frequent sideways glance at Schaffer. "This will take but minutes only," Smith said in a soft and ominous voice. "Anne-Marie, bring in 3 more capsules of scopolamine." He smiled at her. "And I needn't remind you to bring the hypodermics."
"Colonel Kramer," Carracciola said desperately, "this is madness. Are you going to allow the—"
"What do you take Reichsmarshal Rosemere and Colonel Kramer for?" Smith demanded cuttingly. "Credulous fools? Little children? Imbeciles of your own caliber, who imagine you can get away with a cretinous masquerade of this nature? The scopolamine will be used after I have established my own bona fides, and after I have disproved yours. Anne-Marie?" "One moment, Fraulein." Smith, brandy glass in hand, was staring unseeingly into the middle distance. Of course, Smith said softly. "And bring 3 notebooks, will you, my dear?" "3 notebooks?" Colonel Kramer's tone was neutral, his eyes watchful. "3 capsules? You give the impression that we have 4 enemies of the Reich here." "Only 3 enemies that matter," Smith said in weary patience. "The American?" The fact that he neither bothered to glance at Schaffer nor even permit a trace of contempt to creep into his voice showed unmistakably his opinion of the American. "First, why did I invite another guard in and lay down my own gun?" He paused and went on sarcastically. "Of course, because I wanted to increase the odds against myself. Secondly, why didn't I kill Colonel Weissner and his men when I had them at my mercy?" Carracciola said viciously, "Because you knew the shots would be heard." Smith produced an automatic and fired. The sound of the bullet thudding into the couch inches from Carracciola's shoulder completely blanketed the soft plop made by the automatic itself. "Didn't know I had that, did you? I didn't kill Colonel Weissner because German does not kill German." "You are German?" Kramer's eyes were still watchful, but the tone perhaps a shade less neutral.
"Johann Schmidt, at your service."
This with a little bow and click of the heels. "Captain John Smith of the Black Watch." "From the Rhineland, by your accent." "Heidelberg." "But that is my hometown." "Indeed." Smith smiled his interest. "Then I think we have a mutual friend." Momentarily a faraway look came to Kramer's eyes, and he said softly, apparently apropos of nothing, The columns of Charlemagne. Ah, and the fountain in the courtyard of the dear old Friedrichsbar, Smith said nostalgically. He glanced at Kramer, and the nostalgia gave way to a pseudo-mournful reproof. How could you, my dear Colonel? To proceed. Why, third point, I think. Why did I stage this elaborate car accident? Because I knew those 3 impostors wouldn't dare come into the open until they thought I was dead. Anyway, if I were the impostor, would I have come back when I knew the game was up? Anyway, to come back for what? He smiled wearily and nodded at Jones. To rescue another impostor? Kramer said thoughtfully, I must say I'm rather beginning to look forward to hearing what our 3 friends here have to say. I'll tell you now what I've bloody well got to say. Christiansen was on his feet, ignoring the guard's gun, his voice shaking with fury. A tissue of lies from beginning to end. That will do. I require no more, Kramer persisted. Smith said, I promised you proof. Those were but the pointers. A proof to satisfy the Deputy Chief of the German Secret Service, and that proof is in 3 parts. A yes or no, Colonel Kramer, if you please. Do you or do you not know the name of our top man in Britain? Kramer nodded. Then suppose we ask them. Smith produced a small red notebook from his tunic pocket, tore out the central page. He wrote something on the page and handed it to Kramer, who glanced at it and nodded. Smith took the paper from him, walked across to the fire and burned it. Now then, Smith said, put a radio telephone call through to Field Marshal Kesselring's HQ in northern Italy. Ask for his Chief of Military Intelligence. Kramer said softly, The mutual friend you mentioned? An old alumnus of Heidelberg University, Smith nodded. Colonel Wilhelm Willner. He smiled. Willy. You know that? Then it will not be necessary to call him. Admiral Canaris would like you to. And you know my chief, too? Kramer's voice was even softer. My self-esteem urges me to say that I do, but modesty and the truth compels me to admit I don't, Smith said disarmingly. I just work for him. I'm convinced already, convinced beyond all doubt, Rosemeyer said. But do as he says, Colonel. Kramer did as he was told. The phone bell rang. Kramer said, Colonel Wilhelm Willner, my dear friend, Willy, how are you? After the introductory courtesies were over, Kramer said, We have an agent here who claims to know you, a Captain John Smith. Have you ever— Ah, so you know him? Good. A pause, then he continued, Could you describe him? He listened intently, looking at Smith as a voice crackled over the receiver. He replaced the receiver. Our top double agent in the Mediterranean, Kramer said wonderingly, and I'd never even heard of you. Maybe that's why he is what he is, Rosemeyer said dryly. I've been lucky, Smith shrugged, then said briskly, Well then, my credentials? Impeccable, Kramer said. Good. I think you may now proceed without interruption, my dear Schmidt. Smith corrected him. As I was saying, our real agents, while working for the British counter-espionage, have not only been responsible for the deep infiltration of the German Secret Service into the British espionage network in France and the Low Countries, but have also set up an excellent chain of spies in England. It's not my territory, Kramer said, but that, of course, I know. Smith said coldly, To your feet, you impostors, and sit at the table there. From the other side of the table, Smith flung down in front of the 3 men the little notebooks. Then he produced his own notebook from his pocket and laid it on the small table beside Kramer. If they are who they claim to be, Smith said quietly, it would be reasonable, would it not, my dear Kramer, to expect them to be able to write the names and the addresses or contacts of our agents in England and of the British agents who have been supplanted on the continent by our men. He paused significantly. And then compare their lists with the genuine one in my book there. Kramer smiled and turned to the 3 men at the table. Well, you heard? There's something terribly far wrong, Caracciolo began despairingly. Right, Kramer commanded. Sergeant Hartmann. Sergeant Hartmann stepped forward, his leather-thonged blackjack at the ready. The 3 men bent their heads and wrote. Mary rose to her feet and smiled palely at von Brauchitsch.
"I'm so sorry, Captain. I really must go. A most dreadful headache."
"I am sorry, my dear Maria. Come, let me escort you to your room."
No, I'll be all right. Really, I will."
"Captain von Brauchitsch knows what's best."
The face was serious but friendly, the voice authoritative. He tucked her arm protectively under his and led her from the armory. He halted abruptly, peered out a window into the courtyard and said,
"Now that is strange."
He moved on, shaking his head. He quickened his pace.
"Sorry, Fraulein, but I've just remembered I've 1 or 2 reports to prepare."
"I'm sorry if I've kept you from your work, Captain," she said demurely.
How much does he know, she thought wildly.
"We really must get to know each other better," von Brauchitsch said in farewell. "Very much better, my dear Maria," he said softly to himself. "Very much better indeed."
Caracciolo, Thomas, and Christiansen scribbled furiously.
"They seem to be finding plenty of inspiration from somewhere," Kramer said.
The spectacle of an open grave is often thought-provoking, Smith said cynically.
"I'm afraid I don't quite follow."
In 15 minutes they'd be dead, and they know it. The simplicity of true genius, my dear Kramer. Admiral Roland, the head of MI6, and he is a genius, make no mistake.
"So he's a genius," Kramer said impatiently. "Well?"
"Caracciolo, Thomas, and Christiansen were caught 3 weeks ago. Now, as you are aware, they were concerned only with Northwest Europe and were not known here."
"By reputation they were."
It was Smith's turn to be impatient. Roland knew that if General Carnaby— He broke off and scowled across the room at Carnaby-Jones.
"Or that impostor, masquerading as General Carnaby, were taken here, his opposite number in the German army would be sent to interrogate him. Go on, go on."
The Wehrmacht Chief of Staff, Reich Marshal Julius Rosemeyer, would have been just as priceless to the Allies as General Carnaby to us.
"Der Reich Marshal?"
Kramer spoke in a shocked whisper, his eyes straying across the room to Rosemeyer.
"Kidnap?"
"Your precious trusted agents there," Smith said savagely, "and they would have got away with it."
"Germany is eternally in your debt," Kramer said.
He moved away and walked slowly up and down, brandy glass in hand, behind the 3 men bent over the table.
"Let's finish it now," Rosemeyer demanded impatiently.
"If you please, Reich Marshal, let us play this charade out to the bitter end."
"You have your reasons?"
"I most certainly have." Briskly, but not hurriedly, von Brauchitsch walked away from Mary's room. He reached the courtyard and ran across to the helicopter. There was no one there. He hailed the nearest guard, a leashed Doberman trailing behind him.
"Quickly," von Brauchitsch snapped. "Have you seen the pilot?" "No, Herr Major," the guard answered nervously. "Damnation," von Brauchitsch swore. "Tell me, when the pilot is carrying out repairs, is there a place near here he uses as a workshop?"
"Yes, sir."
The guard was eager to oblige.
"That door there, sir, the old grain store."
Von Brauchitsch said coldly,
"Go and find out."
He strode back towards the helicopter and intercepted the elderly guard running from the old grain store.
"There's nobody there, Herr Major. It's empty."
"It would be," von Brauchitsch nodded.
Unhurriedly he made for the main entrance door. He struck oil with the first door he opened. The pilot lay there, still unconscious. The smashed distributor cap lay beside him. Von Brauchitsch cut the pilot's bonds and left him lying there with the door wide open. Von Brauchitsch ran up the stairs to the passage, walked past Mary's bedroom, and stopped at the 5th door beyond that. He used his master keys and passed inside. He lifted the lower sash window and saw that nearly all the snow on the sill had been brushed away, and footprints in the snow told their own unmistakable story. Von Brauchitsch stopped outside Mary's room and knocked. No reply. He used his master keys. No Mary.
"Well," von Brauchitsch murmured, "very interesting indeed."
"Finished?" Smith asked. Thomas nodded. Christiansen and Caracciolo glowered. Kramer picked up the top book and began to read. "Compare it with my original." Kramer nodded.
"As you say, the moment of truth."
He picked up the notebook, slid off the rubber band and opened the cover. The first page was blank. So was the next. And the next. Frowning, baffled, Kramer lifted his eyes to look across the room to Smith. Smith, with a whiplash violent movement of his body, brought the side of his right hand chopping down on the guard's neck. The guard toppled as if a bridge had fallen on him. Kramer's hand stretched out towards the alarm button. Not the buzzer, Mac. The blow that had struck down the guard had held no more whiplash than the biting urgency in Schaffer's voice. He was stretched his length on the floor where he'd dived to retrieve the Schmeiser, now trained rock-steady on Kramer's heart. For the second time that night, Kramer's hand withdrew from the alarm button. Smith picked up the guard's carbine, walked across the room, and changed it for his silenced Luger. Schaffer, his gun trained on Kramer, picked himself up from the floor. Smith walked across to Kramer's table, picked up the 3 notebooks, and buttoned them securely inside his tunic. He said to Schaffer, "Well, time to be gone. Ready, Mr. Jones?" "And hurry," Schaffer added. "We have a streetcar to catch. Well, anyhow, a cable car."
"This is all you want?"
Kramer was calm.
"Those books? Just those books?"
"A bedtime story for MI6.
"I see."
Kramer nodded his understanding.
"Then those men are, of course, what they claim to be."
He broke off as the door opened wide. Mary stood framed in the doorway, and the Mauser was very steady in her hand. "Took your time about getting here, didn't you?" Smith said severely.
"I'm sorry. I just couldn't get away. Von Brakic." "The new girl who arrived tonight," Kramer whispered. "The cousin of that girl from the—"
"None else," Smith said. His gun waved in the direction of Caracciolo, Thomas, and Christiansen. "On your feet, you 3. You're coming with us." "Coming with us?" Schaffer said incredulously. "To England? To stand trial for treason, not to mention Torrance Smythe and Sergeant Harrod." "Drop those guns!" Von Braukitsch's voice was cold and compelling. No one had heard or seen the opening of the door. Smith whirled round, hesitated a fatal fraction of a second because Mary was almost directly in line with von Braukitsch. Von Braukitsch had no such inhibitions. There was a sharp, flat crack. The bullet passed through Mary's sleeve just above the elbow, and Smith exclaimed in pain as he clutched his bleeding hand and heard his flying Luger strike against some furniture. Mary tried to turn round, but von Braukitsch was too quick and too strong. Her hand opened, and her gun fell to the floor. Schaffer dropped his gun.
"You shouldn't have tried it," von Braukitsch said to Smith. "An extremely silly thing to do."
Kramer gave vent to a long, luxurious sigh.
"Oh, well done, my boy, well done. My God, another minute."
He heaved himself to his feet, crossed over to Schaffer, prudently keeping clear of von Braukitsch's line of fire, searched him for hidden weapons, found none, did the same to Smith with the same results, handed him a white handkerchief to stem the flow of blood, looked at Mary and hesitated. "Well, I don't see how she very well can be, but I wonder. Anne-Marie?"
"Certainly, Herr Colonel. It would be a pleasure."
She caught Mary by the hair, pulled her to the side door, opened it and pushed her violently inside. The sound of her body crashing to the floor and another gasp of pain came together. Anne-Marie closed the door behind them.
"I'm afraid Anne-Marie sometimes let her enthusiasm carry her away,"
Kramer conceded.
"Sometimes?"
Von Braukitsch winced as more sounds filtered through the door, the crash of a body against a wall.
"It's over now,"
Kramer sighed.
"It's all over now."
He broke off suddenly, the fractional widening of his eyes matching a similar slumping of his shoulders, and said carefully to von Braukitsch,
"It would seem that we were wasting our sympathy on the wrong person. There's a gun 4 feet from you."
There was indeed a gun pointing at the middle of his back, a Lilliput .21 automatic, and the hand that held it was steady. Apart from the small trickle of blood from her cut lip and the rather dishevelled hair, Mary looked little the worse for wear. "It's every parent's duty," Schaffer said, "to encourage his daughter to take up judo." He took the gun from von Braukitsch's unresisting hand, retrieved his own Schmeiser. Fix the Major's hand as best you can. I'll watch them. While Mary attended to Smith's injured hand in the small room, Schaffer herded his 6 charges onto one of the massive couches. Smith and Mary emerged from the side room, the latter carrying a cloth-covered tray. Schaffer looked at the hand, then lifted an enquiring eyebrow to Mary.
"Not so good."
She looked a little pale herself.
"Forefinger and thumb are both smashed. I've patched it as best I can, but I'm afraid it's a job for a surgeon."
"If I can survive Mary's first aid," Smith said philosophically, "I can survive anything." He tapped his tunic. "Those names and addresses here. Might be an hour or 2 before we get them through to England, and then another hour or 2 before those men can be rounded up." He looked at the men seated on the couch. "You could get through to them in a lot less than that and warn them, so we have to ensure your silence for a few hours." He removed the tray cloth to show bottles and hypodermic syringes. "Nembutal. You'll hardly feel the prick." Smith halted outside the door marked Radio Raum, held up his hand for silence. "Ready now." Carefully, silently, Schaffer eased open the door of the radio room. It was a large, well-lit, but very bleak room. For the first half of Schaffer's stealthy advance across the room, the operator, his back to them, sat smoking a cigarette in idle unconcern. Suddenly, alerted either by a creaking floorboard or just by some sixth sense, he whirled round and appeared to move slightly to his right, shifting the position of his right foot. There came the sudden clamour of an alarm bell in the passage outside. Schaffer leapt forward, his schmeiser swinging, and the operator staggered back against his transceiver, then slid unconscious to the floor. But Schaffer was too late. The bell rang and kept on ringing. Smith swore bitterly. "That's all I bloody well need." He located the glass-cased alarm bell and struck it viciously with the butt of his schmeiser. The clangor abruptly ceased. "Inside," Smith gestured to the open doorway of the radio room. "All of you, quickly." He looked around, saw a side door leading off to the right, and said to Mary, "Quickly, what's in there? Schaffer." "Horatio, hold the bridge," Schaffer murmured. Smith glanced at Mary. "Well?"
"Storage rooms for radio spares, looks like."
"You and Jones take those 3 in there. If they breathe, kill them." He crossed hurriedly to the transceiver, sat down and studied the confusing array of dials, knobs, and switches. Schaffer said from the doorway, "Know how to work it, boss?" "A fine time to ask me," Smith said. "We'll soon find out." "Broadsword calling Danny Boy. Broadsword calling Danny Boy. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?" Nobody heard him. Smith started as a crash of machine pistol fire came from the doorway. "We got callers, boss," Schaffer said apologetically. "Broadsword calling Danny Boy," Smith said urgently. "Broadsword calling Danny Boy. For God's sake, why don't they answer?" "They can't come round the corner of the passage without being sawn in half." Schaffer spoke from his uncomfortable horizontal position on the floor. "For God's sake, Danny Boy," Schaffer implored, "why don't you answer?" "Danny Boy calling Broadsword." The voice on the radio was loud and clear, so free from interference that it might have come from next door. "Danny Boy." "1 hour, Danny Boy," Smith interrupted. 1 hour. Understood? Over." "Understood. You have it, Broadsword?" The voice was unmistakably that of Admiral Rolland. "Over." "I have it," Smith said. "I have it all." "All sins are forgiven. Mother McCree coming to meet you. Leaving now." There came another staccato crash of sound as Schaffer loosed off another burst from his schmeiser. Admiral Rolland's voice on the radio said, "What was that?" "Static," Smith said. He didn't bother to switch off, but moved swiftly across to the window and lifted the lower sash with his left hand. They were on the east side of the castle, the side remote from the cable car header station. Smith withdrew from the window, pulled the nylon from the kit bag, tied one end securely to the metal leg of the radio table, threw the remainder of the rope out into the night, then, with his left hand, rubbed away the frozen snow on both the window-sill and for 2 or 3 feet beneath it. He crossed the room to where Schaffer lay spread-eagled in the doorway. The key was in the lock on the inside of the door, and the lock, he observed with satisfaction, was on the same massive scale as everything else in the Schloss Adler. He said to Schaffer, Time to close the door. Smith and Schaffer moved back into the radio room, soundlessly closed the door behind them, and as soundlessly turned the key in the lock. Schaffer used the leverage of his schmeiser to bend the key so that it jammed. They moved away from the door, passed inside the radio spares room, leaving just a sufficient crack in the doorway to allow a faint backwash of light to filter through. Smith said softly, "Mary, you and Mr. Jones for Thomas there. A gun in each temple." He took Christiansen for himself, forced him to kneel and ground his gun into the back of his neck. Schaffer backed Carracciola against a wall, the muzzle of his schmeiser pressed hard against his teeth. The half-dozen Germans outside the radio room were elite soldiers of the Alpenkorps, ruthless men who had been ruthlessly trained. The door was kicked open. For a moment there was confusion. Then the Oberleutnant ran across to the open window, checked at the sight of the rope disappearing over the sill, leaned out the window, rubbed his now streaming eyes and peered downwards along the beam of his torch. "Gott in Himmel!" he shouted. "They've got away! They're down already! Quickly! The nearest phone!" "Well now." Schaffer listened to the fading sound of running footsteps. "It isn't going to take them too long to find out there are no footprints in the snow down there. It's going to take them even less time to discover this rope is gone." Swiftly, ignoring the stabbing pain in his right hand, Smith hauled the nylon in through the window. "We're going to need it. Take 4 or 5 plastic explosives, each with different fuse length settings. Chuck them into rooms along the corridor there." "Distractions coming up." Smith gave Mary a half-smile and tried the handle of a door beside the low platform, a door lettered Akten Raum, Records Office. Such a door inevitably was locked. He took the Luger in his left hand, placed it against the lock, squeezed the trigger, and went inside. The room was piled ceiling-high with files and papers. Smith put a match to them. The paper flared up at once, the flames feet-high within seconds. They ran along the central passageway, driving the prisoners in front of them, dropped down a central flight of stairs, and were making for the next when they heard the shouting of voices. "Quickly, in behind there!" Smith pointed to a curtained alcove. Nobody touched the curtains. Jack-booted men, gasping heavily for breath, passed by within feet of them. From the next shouted words it was obvious that they had just caught sight of the fire. "Emergency! Sergeant, get on that phone!" It was the voice of the Oberleutnant who had led the break-in to the radio room. "Fire detail at the double! Hoses! More CO2 cylinders! Where in God's name is Colonel Kramer? Corporal! Find Colonel Kramer at once!" The corporal didn't answer. The sound of jutting heels striking the treads as he raced down the stairs was answer enough. Come on, out of it," Smith said urgently. "Right, down those stairs and straight ahead. Mary, you know the door." Mary knew the door. 15 paces from the foot of the stairs she stopped. Smith turned away and said to Mary, "Sure this is the room? 2 stories below the window we came in?" Mary nodded. Smith tried the door handle. The room was locked. The time for skeleton keys and such-like finesse was gone. He placed the barrel of his Luger against the lock. The corporal dispatched by his Oberleutnant to locate Colonel Kramer was faced by the same problem when he turned the handle of the gold drawing-room. He knocked loudly, but there was no response. He hesitated, then fired a burst through the lock. Reich Marshal Rosemeyer was stretched out beside Colonel Kramer. Von Braukitsch and a sergeant were sprawled in armchairs, while Anne-Marie was stretched out on one of the big gold lame couches. All were drugged. Schaffer tied the nylon rope round the head of the iron bedstead, lifted the lower sash window, pushed the rope through and peered unhappily down the valley. "I'm going to feel a mite conspicuous out there, boss," Schaffer said. "And there's a wolf pack loose down below there." Schaffer eased himself through the window and halted momentarily as a muffled explosion came from the eastern wing of the castle. "Number 1, Schaffer said with satisfaction. Smith joined Schaffer on the roof. Both men crouched low to minimize the chances of being spotted from below. For the first 10 feet out from the wall, the roof was quite flat, then dropped away sharply at an angle of 30 degrees. "Pitons we don't need. Look at this." With his bare hands, Schaffer scraped at the snow-encrusted roof of the header station, to reveal a fine wire netting, and below that, iron bars covering a pane of plate glass.
Skylights, I believe they're called. Those bars look pretty firm to me.
Schaffer grinned in satisfaction, passed the rope round the bar, and made no mistake about the knot he tied. Smith sat down on the roof and put his hand to the rope.
No, you don't.
Schaffer lifted Smith's right hand.
This one is on me.
He slid smoothly down the sloping surface. As he approached the roof edge, he turned round until he was pointing head down. He was, he discovered, directly above one of the cables. 200 feet below, guards and Dobermans were floundering uphill through the deep snow. Schaffer realized every available man was being pulled in either to fight the fire or to help in the search for the men who had started it. He twisted his head and looked upwards. There was no sign of any guard patrolling the battlements. Schaffer eased himself downwards another perilous 6 inches, till head and shoulders were over the edge of the roof. Then he was in. There was neither guard nor winch attendant inside. All Schaffer could see was a cable car, heavy winching machinery, and heavy banks of lead-acid batteries. The only way in was by dropping down onto the Luftseilbahn's heavy steel cable, then overhanding himself up inside the station. It had to be possible. Carefully, Schaffer inched himself back up the rope and the slope of the roof until he was about 3 feet clear of the edge. He eased his foot grip on the rope and swung round through 180 degrees until he was once more facing up the slope, with his legs now dangling over the edge. His searching feet found the cable. He started to climb. He almost failed to make it. For every 6 inches he made up the cable, he slid back 5. The cable was covered by a diabolically slippery coating of oil and sheath ice. Later, sweating and gasping like a long-distance runner, and very close to the last stages of exhaustion, he hauled himself onto the roof of the cable car. He lowered himself wearily to the floor. There was no one there. He had the place to himself. At the lower end of the sloping archway leading up to the castle courtyard, the heavy iron door stood wide. He passed through this doorway and padded softly up the cobbled pathway until he came to the courtyard exit. Here, too, was another iron gate, as wide open as the other. Schaffer moved as far forward as the shadowing safety of the tunnel's overhang permitted, and looked cautiously around. Only a suicide would have tried making his escape through a courtyard crowded with 60 or 70 Alpenkorps troops. Suddenly, a loud, flat explosion echoed inside the confining walls of the square. Schaffer briefly wondered which of his diversionary explosives that might be. Some instinct made him glance to his right, and his face went very still. The men he'd seen floundering up the slope outside, guards with the Doberman pinchers, were coming through the main gate. Schaffer swung the heavy iron door to, slid home 2 heavy bolts, ran quickly down the arched passageway, and padlocked the lower door and put the key in his pocket. He looked up, startled, at a loud crashing of glass and the subsequent tinkle as the shattered fragments tinkled to the floor. Automatically, the barrel of his Luger followed his glance. "Put that cannon away," Smith said irritably. "It's my nerves," Schaffer explained coldly. "What winch controls are there?" Smith asked. "A small lever marked normal and—" "Not fall." "Are there batteries down there?" Smith interrupted. "Yeah, any amount." "Put the lever to not fall. Emergency. They could cut off the main power from inside the castle." "Okay, it's done." Then there are start and stop buttons, a big mechanical handbrake, and a gear lever affair marked forwards and backwards with a neutral position. "Start the motor," Smith ordered. Schaffer pressed the start button, and a generator whined into life. "Lower it down till it's halfway past the edge of the roof. We'll slide down the rope onto the top of the cable car, then you can bring us up inside." "I'm sending Caracciola, Thomas, and Christiansen down first," Smith said. Caracciola straightened until he was kneeling, glanced down the slope of the roof to the depths of the valley beyond. "You're not getting me on that lot, not ever!" He shook his head, then stared up at Smith, his black eyes implacable in their hate. Smith thrust him away contemptuously, and Caracciola had to grab wildly at the rope to prevent himself from sliding over the break of the roof. He slid down the rope until first his feet, then his hands found the security of the supporting bracket of the cable car. Smith gestured with his gun towards Thomas. Thomas went without a word. 10 seconds later, Christiansen followed him. Smith watched the cable car begin to move up inside the station, then looked upwards to the window from which the rope dangled. "Mr. Jones?" "I'm still here." Carnaby Jones's voice had a quaver to it, and he didn't as much venture to risk a glance over the window-sill. "Not for much longer, I hope," Smith said seriously. "They'll be coming for you, Mr. Jones. Oh, God, when they strip you off and strap you down on the torture table." 2 seconds later, Carnaby Jones was over the sill and sliding down the nylon rope. The cable car, with the 3 men clinging grimly to the suspension bracket, climbed slowly up into the header station and jerked to a halt. One by one, the 3 men, under the persuasion of Schaffer's gently waving Luger, lowered themselves. The last of them, Thomas, seemed to land awkwardly. As he fell, his hands shot out and grabbed Schaffer by the ankles. Schaffer, immediately off balance, was winded by a diving tackle by Christiansen. A second later, Christiansen had his gun, driving the muzzle cruelly into a throat gasping for air. Caracciola was already at the lower iron door, shaking it fiercely. His eye caught sight of the big padlock in its hasp. He swung round, ran back towards Schaffer. "That padlock! Where's the key to that bloody padlock?" Schaffer fumbled in his pockets, eventually located the key and brought it out, offering it vaguely in Caracciola's direction. Schaffer abruptly straightened and, with a convulsive jerk of his arm, sent the key spinning through the open end of the station to land in the valley hundreds of feet below. Caracciola picked up Schaffer's fallen Schmeiser and swung it viciously across the American's head and face. Schaffer fell like a tree. "Into the cable car, you two!" Caracciola waited until they had boarded, walked across the floor until he was directly under the smashed skylight and called, "Boss!" Schaffer's silenced Luger was in his hand. "Schaffer?" Smith called softly. "Lieutenant Schaffer, are you there?" "Right here, boss." Midwest accent, Schaffer to the life. Smith's radar scope went into high. He crawled soundlessly forward. The wind from the Luger's shell rifled his hair. Down below, someone cursed in anger and frustration. "That's the last chance you'll ever have, Caracciola," Smith said. From where he lay, he could just see Schaffer's face, or the bloody mask that covered his face. It was impossible to tell whether he was alive or dead. "Wrong again. Merely the postponement of a pleasure. We're leaving now, Smith. I'm going to start the motor." The cable car leapt forward with a violent jerk. Caracciola ran for it, jumped inside, turned and slammed the door of the cable car. On the roof above, Smith laid down his useless Schmeiser. His face was bleak and bitter. "Well, that's it then," Mary said. Her voice was unnaturally calm. "Finish. All finish. Operation Overlord and us, if that matters." "It matters to me." Smith took out his silenced automatic and held it in his good left hand. "Keep an eye on Junior here." "No!" For perhaps 2 dazed, incredulous seconds that were the longest seconds she had ever known, Mary had quite failed to gather Smith's intention. When shocked understanding did come, her voice rose to a scream. "No! No! For God's sake, no!" Smith ignored the heartbroken voice, the desperate clutching hand, and walked to the end of the flat section of the roof. At the lower edge of the steeply sloping roof section, the leading edge of the cable car had just come into view. A cable car with inside it 3 men who were exchanging delighted grins and thumping one another joyously on the back. Smith ran down the ice-coated pitch of the roof, reached the edge and jumped. The cable car was already 7 or 8 feet beyond him and almost as far below. Had the cable car not been going away from him, he must surely have broken both legs. As it was, he landed with a jarring, teeth-rattling crash. A crash that caused the cable car to shudder and sway, and his legs to buckle and slide from beneath him on the ice-coated roof. His injured right hand failed to find a purchase on the suspension bracket, and in his blindly despairing grab with his left hand he was forced to drop his Luger. It slid to the edge of the roof and fell away into the darkness of the valley below. In their own way, the 3 men inside the cable car were as nearly stunned as Smith himself. The smiles had frozen on their faces, and Christiansen's arm was still poised in mid-air, where it had been arrested by the sound and the shock of Smith's landing on the cable car roof. Carracciola, predictably, was the first to recover and react. He snatched the Schmeiser from Christiansen and pointed it upwards. The cable car was now 40 to 50 feet clear of the castle, and the high wind was beginning to swing it pendulum-like across the sky. Smith, weakened by the impact of the fall, the pain in his hand and the loss of blood, hung on grimly and dizzily to the suspension bracket, his body athwart the roof of the car. He felt sick and exhausted, and there seemed to be a mist in front of his eyes. From shoulder to knee, and only inches from his body, a venomous burst of machine pistol fire stitched a pattern of holes in the cable car roof. The mists cleared away from Smith's eyes more quickly than he would have believed possible. A Schmeiser magazine held far more shells than that. They would wait a second or two to see if a falling body passed any of the side windows, and if none came, then they would fire again. But where? What would be the next area of roof chosen for treatment? Would the gunman fire at random, or to a systematic pattern? It was impossible to guess. Perhaps at that very moment the muzzle of the Schmeiser was only inches from the middle of his spine. The very thought was enough to galvanize Smith into a quick roll that stretched him out over the line of holes that had just been made. It was unlikely that the gunman would fire in exactly the same place again, but even that was a gamble. The gunman might figure just as Smith was doing and traverse the same area again. But he wasn't figuring the same as Smith. The next burst was 3 feet away towards the trailing end of the car. Using the suspension bracket as support, Smith pulled himself to his feet until he was quite vertical, hanging onto the cable itself. This way, the possible target area was lessened by 80%. Quickly, soundlessly, sliding his hands along the cable, he moved forward until he was standing at the very front of the car. The cable car's angle of arc through the sky was increasing with every swing of the pendulum. The purchase for his feet was minimal. All the strain came on his arms, and by far the greater part of that on his sound left arm. There was nothing smoothly progressive about the cable car's sideways motion through the sky. It jumped and jerked and jarred and jolted, like a dervish dancer in the last seconds before total collapse. The strain on the left arm was intolerable. It felt as if the shoulder sinews were being torn apart. But shoulder sinews are repairable, whereas the effects of a Schmeiser blast at point-blank range were not. And it seemed to Smith highly unlikely that anybody would waste a burst on that particular spot where he was standing. The obvious position for any roof passenger who didn't want to be shaken off into the valley below was flat out on the roof, with his arms wrapped for dear life round one of the suspension arm support brackets. His reasoning was correct. There were 3 more bursts, none of which came within feet of him, and then no more. Smith knew that he would have to return to the comparative security of the suspension arm and return there soon. He was nearly gone. The grip of his left hand on the cable was weakening. He would have to get back, and he would have to get back now. He prayed that the Schmeiser's magazine was empty. And then, and for another reason, he knew that he had no option but to go now, and he knew his prayer hadn't been answered. The leading door of the cable car opened, and a head and a hand appeared. The head was Carracciola's. The hand held the Schmeiser. Carracciola was looking upwards even as he leaned out, and he saw Smith immediately. He leaned farther out still, swung the Schmeiser one-handedly until the stock rested on his shoulder and squeezed the trigger. Smith had already let go of the cable and was flinging himself convulsively backward when the first of the bullets ripped off his left-hand epaulette. The second grazed his left shoulder, a brief burning sensation, but the rest of the burst passed harmlessly over his head. He landed heavily, stretched out blindly, located and grasped one of the suspension arms, and scuttled crab-like round the base of the suspension arm until he had it and what little pathetic cover it offered between him and Carracciola. But Carracciola was coming after him. He had the gun still in his hand, and that gun could have very few shells indeed left in the magazine. It would be no part of Carracciola's plan to waste any of those shells. Even as Smith watched, Carracciola seemed to rise effortlessly 3 feet into the air, a feat of levitation directly attributable to the powerful boost given him by Thomas and Christiansen, jackknifed forward at hip level and flattened his body on top of the cable car roof. His legs still dangled over the leading edge. Within seconds, his scrabbling fingers had found safety, a gash in the cable car roof that had been torn open by one of the bursts from the Schmeiser. Carracciola's fingers hooked securely, and he pulled himself forward until he was in a kneeling position, his toes hooked over the leading edge. Smith reached up with his wounded hand and crawled desperately for a grenade in the canvas bag slung over his left shoulder, at the same time pushing himself as far back as his anchoring left hand, clutched round a suspension bracket, would permit. At that range, a grenade could do almost as much damage to himself as to Carracciola. His legs slid back until his feet projected over the trailing edge, and he cried out in pain as a tremendous pressure, a bone-breaking, skin-tearing pressure, was applied to his shins, halfway between knees and feet. Someone had him by the ankles, and that someone seemed determined to separate his feet from the rest of his body. Smith twisted his head round, but all he could see was a pair of hands round his ankles, knuckles bone-white in the faint wash of moonlight. Smith risked a quick glance forward, but Carracciola hadn't moved. The cable car was now halfway between the header station and the top pylon. The pendulum swing was at its maximum, and Carracciola, still in his kneeling position, was hanging on for his life. Smith abandoned his attempts to reach for a grenade, which could now serve no purpose whatsoever, unsheathed his knife, clasped his haft in the 3 good fingers of his right hand, twisted round, and tried to strike at those hands that were causing him such excruciating agony. He couldn't get within 15 inches of them. His legs were breaking, his left arm was breaking, and his clenched grip on the support was slowly beginning to open. He had only seconds to go, Smith knew, and so he had nothing in the world to lose. He changed his grip on his knife, caught the tip of the blade between his broken thumb and the rest of his fingers, turned and threw the knife as powerfully and as accurately as his smashed hand and pain-dimmed eyes would permit. The stinging pain in his left ankle and the scream of pain from the trailing door were simultaneous. Immediately, all the pressure on his ankles vanished. A second later, Christiansen, whom Thomas had managed to drag back inside the cable car, was staring stupidly at the knife that transfixed his right wrist. In that one instant, Smith had won and he had lost. Or so it most surely seemed, for he was defenseless now. Carracciola had bided his time, calculated his chances, and flung himself forward until he had reached the safety of the suspension bracket. Now he pulled himself slowly to his feet, his left arm round the suspension arm itself, his left leg twined securely round one of the brackets. The Schmeiser pointed into Smith's face. "Only one bullet left." Carracciola's smile was almost pleasant. "I had to make sure, you see." Perhaps he hadn't lost, Smith thought. Perhaps he hadn't lost after all. Because of the pinioning effect of Christiansen's hand on his ankles, he'd been unaware until now how much less difficult it had become to maintain position on that ice-sheathed roof, unaware how much the pendulum swaying of the cable car had been reduced. And it seemed that even now Carracciola was still unaware of it, or if the change of motion had registered with him, the reason for it had not. With a conscious effort of will, Smith shifted his by now half-hypnotized gaze from the staring muzzle of the Schmeiser to a point just over Carracciola's shoulder. The suspension arm of the first pylon was less than 20 feet away. "Too bad, Smith." Carracciola steadied the barrel of his machine pistol. "Comes to us all. Be seeing you." "Look behind you," Smith said. Carracciola half smiled in weary disbelief that anyone should try that ancient one on him. Smith glanced briefly a second time over Carracciola's shoulder, winced and looked away. The disbelief vanished from Carracciola's face as if a light had been switched off. Some sixth sense or instantaneous flash of comprehension, or just some sudden certainty of knowledge, made him twist round and glance over his shoulder. He cried out in terror, the last sound he ever made. The steel suspension arm of the pylon smashed into his back. 1 second later, he was swept from the roof of the cable car. But by that time, Carracciola was already dead. From the open rearward door of the car, Thomas and Christiansen, their shocked faces mirroring their stunned disbelief, watched the broken body tumbling down into the darkness of the valley below. Shaking like a man with the ague, and moving like an old man in a dream, Smith slowly and painfully hauled himself forward until he was in a sitting position with an arm and leg wound round one of the after arms of the supporting bracket. Still in the same dreamlike slow motion, he lifted his head and gazed down the valley. The other cable car, moving up valley on its reciprocal course, had just passed the lowermost of the 3 pylons. From his kit bag, Smith extracted 2 packets of plastic explosives and wedged them firmly between the roof of the car and the 2 after arms of the suspension bracket, making sure that the tear-strip igniters were exposed and ready to hand. Then he braced himself, sitting upright against the suspension brackets, using both arms and legs to anchor himself, and prepared to sit it out once more as the cable car, approaching mid-section of its second lap between the first and central pylons, steadily increased its swaying angle of arc across the night sky. It was foolish of him, he knew, to sit like that. The snow had momentarily stopped, and the full moon, riding palely in an empty sky, was flooding the valley with a wash of ghostly light. Sitting as he was, he must, he realized, be clearly visible from either the castle or the lower station. But apart from the fact that he doubted whether concealment mattered any longer, he knew there was nothing he could do about it. There wasn't the strength left in his one good arm to allow him to assume the prone, spread-eagled position that he and Schaffer had used on the way up. He wondered about Schaffer, wondered about him in a vague, woolly, detached way for which exhaustion, loss of blood, and the bitter cold were almost equally responsible. He wondered about the others, too. Schaffer was feeling even more vague and woolly than Smith, if for different reasons. He was awake, but this was one of those bad dreams, and that soft, urgent voice was still calling. "Lieutenant Schaffer! Lieutenant Schaffer!" He twisted his head to locate the source of the voice. Are you all right?" Mary asked. Schaffer considered this ridiculous question carefully. "I expect I shall be," he said with great restraint. He broke off and turned slowly to face the door. "What was that?" "A dog. It sounded like a dog barking." "That's what I thought." He staggered drunkenly across to the lower iron door and put his ear to it. "Dogs," he said. "They're onto us. Where's the Major?" He went after them. The voice was empty of all feeling. He jumped onto the top of the cable car. "He did, eh?" Schaffer received the news as if Smith's action had been the most natural and inevitable thing in the world. The cable car was 10 yards away from the central pylon. The ascending car on the other cable was now almost as close to the central pylon as his own. It didn't seem possible that he could make it in time. Smith, upright now, tore off the 2 friction fuses, straightened, and holding the cable in his left hand, took up position just on the inner side of the car roof. He took 2 more slipping, sliding steps, and launched himself towards the ice-coated cable which supported the ascending cable car. His left hand caught the cable. He released his grip, dropped on all fours, and reached out blindly but successfully for one of the arms of the suspension bracket. He had made it. The cable car he had so recently abandoned was now hardly more than 50 yards from the lowermost pylon. Thomas and Christiansen sat huddled in the middle, the latter wrapping a makeshift bandage round his injured hand. From the roof of the cable car came a brilliant flash of light, magnesium blinding in its white intensity. Simultaneously, there came the sound of two sharp explosions, so close together as to be indistinguishable in time. The two rear supports of the suspension bracket broke, and the car, suspended now by only the two front supports, tilted violently, the front going up, the rear down. Inside, the angle of the floor of the car changed in an instant from the horizontal to at least 30 degrees. Christiansen was flung back towards the still-open rear door. He grabbed despairingly at the side, but he grabbed with his wounded hand. Soundlessly, he vanished through the open doorway, and as soundlessly fell to the depths of the valley below. Despite the cable's violent buffeting caused by the sudden release of the weight of the car, Thomas had managed to hang on. The knuckles of the hands gleamed like burnished ivory. And then suddenly there were no hands there, just the suspension arm and the empty wire, as the cable car fell silently away, slowly turning end over end. "Hurry, hurry!" Smith flung open the rear door of the cable car. "Inside, all of you!" He retrieved Schaffer's Luger from the floor, then whirled round as he heard the furious barking of dogs. Jones had made no move to go. "I'm not very good at heights, I'm afraid." Smith nodded consideringly, held out his right hand, said, "Mr. Jones, good luck," threw him a left-hander, and half-dragged, half-carried the dazed Jones into the cable car. Moments later, Carnaby Jones struggled slowly to a sitting position, gazed uncomprehendingly around him until he realized where he was, rubbed his jaw tenderly, and said to Smith, "That was a dirty trick." "It was all of that," Smith acknowledged. "I'm sorry." "I'm not," Jones smiled shakily. "Somehow I don't really think I'm cut out to be a hero." "Neither am I, brother, neither am I," Schaffer said mournfully. He lifted his head from his hands and looked slowly around. His eyes were still glassy and only partially focusing, but a little colour was returning to his right cheek, the one that wasn't masked in blood. "Our three friends, what became of our three friends?" "Dead. Here comes the last pylon. Another minute or so and we're home and dry." 20 seconds passed. "Not much more than 100 feet to go," Smith said. "I'm going to open that door in a few seconds. There's 2 or 3 feet of snow down there. Should cushion our fall enough." Suddenly the cable car jerked to a violent and abrupt stop. "All out!" Smith shouted. "All out!" "There speaks the eternal shop steward," Schaffer said. As the cable car jerked and started to move back up the valley, Schaffer quickly lowered Mary, Carnaby Jones and Smith to the soft yielding snow below, before jumping down himself. He staggered as he landed, but maintained balance. Smith was beside him in an instant. He had fished out a plastic explosive from the bag which he handed to Schaffer, and said, "You have a good right arm." "I have a good right arm, horses no, baseball yes." Schaffer took aim, and lobbed the explosive neatly through the doorway of the disappearing cable car. "Like that?" "Like that. Come on." Smith turned, and catching Mary by the arm while Schaffer hustled Carnaby Jones along, ran down the side of the lower station and into the shelter of the nearest house. The castle burned more fiercely than ever, a fire obviously totally out of control. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack of an explosion, and the ascending cable car burst into flames. Colonel Wyatt Turner looked at the relaxed figure in the pilot's seat, at the world-weary face that contrasted so oddly with the magnificent panache of the red handlebar moustache. "Can you make it in time?" "I can make it," Carpenter said comfortably. "Point is, will they? God only knows. I don't see how they can." "And that is why you came?" "I sent them," Wyatt Turner said emptily. "Must you fly so close to the damn ground?" "Enemy radar, old chap," Carpenter said soothingly. Smith, with Mary and Jones behind him and Schaffer bringing up the rear, skirted the backs of the houses on the east side of the village street, and cautiously made their way through the automobile junkyard to the rear double doors of Sulz's garage. Heidi stood there. She stared at them as if they were creatures from another world. "All here in black and white," Smith patted his tunic. "Into the bus." The middle finger of Smith's blood-stained, bandaged hand reached for the starter button, and the big diesel caught at once. Smith aimed the angled point of the massive snow plough at the junction of the double doors, and for all the resistance the doors offered, they might have been made of brown paper. Farther down the street, outside Zum Wildenhirsch, a group of Alpenkorps motorcyclists standing just outside the door stared incredulously up the street. They caught a brief glimpse of Smith hunched over the steering wheel and of Schaffer crouched behind, the Schmeiser sticking out through the right-hand shattered windscreen. Ahead of him now, Smith could see the road stretch almost arrow-straight alongside the dark waters of the Blaue See. Schaffer shortened his gaze and tried to locate the three others, but all were on the floor, under seats and completely concealed. He cursed as the shaking and shuddering bus lurched violently, throwing himself against the right-hand front door, then straightened and peered at the illuminated dashboard. The barrack gates were barely 200 yards away. Both the area around the guardhouse and the parade ground beyond were brilliantly illuminated by overhead floodlamps. Scores of armed soldiers seemed to be running around in purposeless confusion. "A hive of activity and no mistake," Schaffer observed. "I wonder—" A giant tank came rumbling into view past the guardhouse, turned right onto the road, stopped, swiveled 180 degrees on its tracks, completely blocking the road. The gun turret moved fractionally until it was lined up on the headlights of the approaching bus. Smith stopped the bus and addressed the soldiers. "Quickly, telephone! Surgeon to the sick bay!" He jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "Colonel Weissner, they got him twice, through the lungs. For God's sake, don't just stand there!" But the post bus," the sergeant protested. "We had a call from—" "Drunk, by God!" Smith swore savagely. "He'll be court-martialed in the morning." His voice dropped menacingly. "And you, if the colonel dies. Move!" Smith engaged gear and drove off, still at walking pace. Ahead of the post bus was a group of officers, most of them obviously senior, talking animatedly. Smith slowed down the bus even more and leaned from the window. "They're trapped!" he called excitedly. "Upstairs in Zum Wildenhirsch! They've got Colonel Weissner as hostage! Hurry, for God's sake!" He broke off as he suddenly recognized one of the officers, as the Alpenkorps captain to whom in his temporary capacity of Major Bernd Himmler he'd spoken in Zum Wildenhirsch earlier that evening. A second later the recognition was mutual. The captain's mouth fell open in total incredulity, and before he had time to close it, Smith's foot was flat on the accelerator. Smith all but lost control of the bus as something struck a glancing blow low down on his cab door, ricocheted off into the night with a viciously screaming whine, and exploded in a white flash of snow-flurried light less than 50 yards ahead. "The Tiger tank!" Schaffer shouted. "The goddamn 88mm!" The next one came through the top of the back door, traversed the length of the bus and exited through the front of the roof, just above the windscreen. He winced and ducked low as a third shell took out most of the left-hand windows of the bus, showering himself and Schaffer with a flying cloud of shattered glass fragments. Smith glanced in the rearview mirror and steadied the wildly swaying bus up on a steadier course. "Never thought I'd be glad to see a few carloads or truckloads of Alpenkorps coming after me." He changed into top gear and pushed the accelerator to the floor. "I'm happy to make an exception this time." Schaffer turned and looked through the shattered rear windows. He could count at least 3 pairs of headlights on the road behind him, with 2 others swinging out through the southern gates. Between them, they effectively blotted the post bus from the view of the tank gunner. Schaffer strode rapidly down the central aisle, passing by Mary, Heidi, and Carnaby Jones, all of whom were struggling rather shakily to their feet, and looked at the crates stacked in the rear seats. 6 crates, he said to Heidi, "and we asked for only 2. Honey, you're going to make me the happiest man alive." He opened the rear door and began to empty the contents of the crates onto the road. The first of the 2 leading pursuit cars was within 300 yards of the bus when it ran into the area of broken glass. The car's headlights began to slew violently from side to side. The screeching of brakes was clearly audible above the sound of the postbus's diesel, but not nearly as loud as the rending crash of metal as the second car smashed into the rear of the first. "Neat," Schaffer said admiringly. "Very neat, Schaffer." He called to Smith. "That'll hold them, boss." "Sure it'll hold them," Smith said grimly. "It'll hold them for all of a minute. You can't burst heavy truck tires that way, and it won't take them long to bulldoze those cars out of the way. Heidi?" Hardy walked forward, shivering in the icy gale blowing through both the chateau front and side windows. "Yes, Major?" "How far to the wooden bridge? What do you call it? Zur alten Brücke?" 2 miles. 3 minutes. At the most, that. He raised his voice. 3 minutes, Lieutenant. Can you do it?" "I can do it." Schaffer was already lashing together packages of plastic explosives. It was not, Smith thought, a bridge he would have chosen to have crossed with a bicycle, much less a 6-ton bus. Nevertheless, he hit this elderly and decrepit edifice at 40 miles per hour. 10 feet from the edge of the bridge, he stamped on the brakes and skidded to a sliding halt, on solid ground again in less than 20 yards. Schaffer already had the back door open and the 2 packages of plastic explosives in his hands before the bus stopped. Smith already had the bus in gear and was moving away when Schaffer flung himself through the back doorway and was hauled inside by helping hands. Schaffer twisted round just in time to see the headlamps of the pursuing car sweep into sight. It was now less than 100 yards from the bridge and accelerating. For a brief, almost panic-stricken moment, Schaffer wondered wildly if he had cut the fuses short enough. The 2 loud, flat detonations, each fractionally preceded by the brilliant white flash characteristic of the plastic explosive, came within 1 second of each other. One moment, a bridge, the next, an empty ravine. The car struck a large rock, rolled over twice, and came to a halt less than 6 feet from the edge of the ravine. 3 minutes later, they were out of the forest. The headlamps successively illuminated a narrow, cleared runway stretching into the distance, and a bullet-riddled mosquito bomber with a crumpled undercarriage. Colonel Wyatt Turner glanced through the side screen. "You're sure we're on the right course?" "No question, that's the Vice Pizza there. 3 minutes flying time." Carpenter paused and went on thoughtfully. "Looks uncommon like Guy Fawkes night up there, don't you think?" Schaffer had the headlights switched on main beam, illuminating the runway as the mosquito sank down over the top of the bus and settled down beautifully without the slightest suspicion of a bounce. Half a minute later, with all 5 of them safely inside the plane, the mosquito banked and headed for the northwest and home. Wing Commander Carpenter pulled luxuriously at his evil-smelling briar. He was well content. His 5 newly acquired passengers were perhaps a fraction less content. They lacked Carpenter's well-upholstered pilot's seat. Colonel Wyatt Turner, still holding across his knees the Sten gun he'd had at the ready, in case any trouble had developed on the ground, or the flashing lights of the bus had been a German ruse, was sitting sideways in the co-pilot's seat, so he could see and talk to the pilot and the passengers at the same time. Wyatt Turner said, "All dead, my best men." "All of them, sir?" Smith asked softly. Wyatt Turner shook his head wearily and drew a hand across his eyes. "Did you find out who?" "Carracciola." Smith's voice was still quiet, still even. "And Christiansen. And Thomas." He looked consideringly at Smith. "You've been through a lot, Major Smith. You're not well." "I'm not as well as I was," Smith admitted. "But I was well enough when I killed them." You killed them?" "I've killed a traitor before now. You know that." But traitors? All 3 of them? Impossible. I can't believe it. I won't believe it." "Then maybe you'll believe this, sir." Smith produced one of the notebooks. "This is the most important document in Europe, the most important document I have ever seen," Wyatt Turner sighed. "The nation is deeply in your debt, Major Smith." "Thank you, sir." "Or would have been. It's a great pity it will never have the chance to express its gratitude." He lifted the Sten from his knees and pointed it at Smith's heart. "You'll do nothing foolish, will you, Major Smith?" "What in God's name—" Carpenter twisted in his seat and stared at Wyatt Turner. "Concentrate on your flying, my dear Wing Commander. We'll be landing at Lille Airport within an hour." Smith said dryly, "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the most dangerous spy in Europe, the most successful double agent of all time." "You knew?" "I knew about you," Smith nodded. "But we all knew about you, didn't we, Colonel? 3 years, you claim, behind the German lines. Served with the Wehrmacht and finally penetrated the Berlin High Command. Sure you did. With the help of the Wehrmacht and the High Command. But when the tide of war turned and you could no longer feed the Allies with false and misleading reports about proposed German advances, then you were allowed to escape back to England, to feed the Germans true and accurate reports about Allied plans, and give them all the information they required to round up British agents in northwest Europe. How many million francs do you have in your numbered accounts in Zurich, Colonel? Wing Commander Carpenter stared straight ahead through the windscreen and said very slowly, "Frankly, old chap, this is preposterous." "Try batting an eyelid and see just how preposterous that Sten gun is," Smith suggested. He looked at Wyatt Turner again. "You underestimated Admiral Rolland, I'm afraid. He's had his suspicions about you and 4 section leaders of Department C for months. But he was wrong about Torrance Smythe." "You know that? You know all that?" Wyatt Turner's voice was quiet and vicious. He lifted the Sten slightly. "What goes on, Smith?" "All prearranged to force your hand. We had everything, except proof about you. I got that proof this evening. Colonel Kramer knew that we were coming, knew we were after General Carnaby." He nodded towards Jones. "Incidentally, meet Cartwright Jones, an American actor." "What?" Wyatt Turner forced out the word as if a pair of powerful hands were squeezing on his windpipe. "General Carnaby is spending a quiet weekend at the Admiral's country house in Wiltshire. As a stand-in, Mr. Jones was quite admirable." Wyatt Turner tried to speak, but the words failed to come. The colour had drained from his ruddy face. "And why did Kramer know?" "He knew because you had informed Berlin as soon as Rolland had put the plan to you. Nobody else had the chance to. And he knew that we would be in Zum Wildenhirsch this evening. He knew because I told you on the radio broadcast this morning, and you lost no time in passing the good word on." Smith sighed. "You just had to come to meet us, hadn't you, Colonel? This was the last door to life left open to you. In my final broadcast, I told the Admiral, I have it all." Wyatt Turner lined his Sten on Smith. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't shoot you now." "I can do that," Smith added. "Why do you think that Admiral Rolland accompanied you to the airport? He never has before." "Go on." Wyatt's voice was hard, abrupt, but his eyes were sick with the sudden certainty of defeat and death. "To make quite certain that you took that Sten and only that Sten with you. Tell me, can you see 2 parallel scores where the stock meets the barrel?" Wyatt Turner stared at him for a long moment, then glanced down quickly at the Sten. There were 2 unmistakable parallel scratches exactly where Smith had said they would be. "That's right," Smith said. "I personally filed off the firing pin exactly 36 hours ago." Wyatt Turner slowly lowered the Sten to the floor, then quickly whirled in his seat, jerked open the door, and threw the notebook out into the night. He turned and smiled bleakly at Smith. "The most important document in Europe, I believe I called it." "So you did." Smith handed his gun to Schaffer, reached under his tunic, and brought out 2 more books. "Duplicates." "Duplicates?" The smile slowly faded from the heavily jowled face, leaving it frozen in defeat. "Duplicates," he whispered. He looked slowly around them all, and then finally back at Smith, who had retrieved his gun from Schaffer. He said, "Are you going to shoot me?" "No." Wyatt Turner nodded, slid back the door to its widest extent, and said, "Can you really see me in the tower?" He stepped forward into the doorway. "No," Smith shook his head. "No, I can't see that." "Mind the step," said Schaffer. His voice was cold and empty. His face was carved from stone.
So that's the way he went.
Admiral Rolland, telephone in hand and standing by the big transceiver in his London Operations HQ, looked old and very, very tired.
"Maybe it's all for the best, Smith. And you have all the information you want?"
Smith's voice crackled over the earphone.
"Everything, sir. Magnificent, magnificent. I have all the police forces in the country alerted. As soon as we get that book, there's a car waiting for you at the airport. See you in an hour. Yes, sir. There's one thing, sir, a small thing. I want to get married this morning. You what? Grey, bushy eyebrows lifted towards the mane of white hair. I want to get married, Smith explained slowly and patiently, to Miss Mary Ellison. But you can't, Roland protested. This morning? Impossible! There are such things as bans, permits. The registrar's office will be shut today. After all I've done for you, Smith interrupted reproachfully. Blackmail, sir. You play on an old man's gratitude. Downright blackmail. Roland banged down the phone, smiled tiredly, and picked up another phone. Operator, put me through to the forgery section. Wing Commander Carpenter, his pipe well alight and by his elbow a cup of coffee newly poured from a vacuum flask, was his old, imperturbable self again. Smith talked quietly to Mary, while Jones had his eyes closed and appeared to be asleep. Farther aft in the fuselage, Schaffer had his arm around Heidi, who was making no attempt to fight him off. "Right," Schaffer said. "So we go to this pub tonight, see?" "You said the Savoy Grill," Heidi reminded him. "A rose by any other name. So we go to this pub, and we'll have pâté, smoked trout, sirloin of Aberdeen Angus." "Aberdeen Angus?" Heidi looked at him in amusement. "Forgotten the war, haven't you? Forgotten rationing? More like a sirloin of horse meat." "Honey," Schaffer took her hands and spoke severely and earnestly. "Honey, don't ever again mention that word to me. I'm allergic to horses." "You eat them?" Heidi gazed at him in astonishment. "In Montana?" "I fall off them," Schaffer said moodily. "Everywhere."